Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where the quiet hours find their shape in stories that the daylight never quite has time for. Tonight, we're going somewhere cold, somewhere wide and grey and very, very old. We're going out onto the North Atlantic, where the water runs deep and dark and keeps its own counsel, and where, on a December afternoon in 1872, a ship was found sailing by itself across an empty sea. No crew, no passengers, no explanation left behind. Just a vessel moving through the waves as if nothing had happened, as if the 10 people who had been living and working on board had simply stepped sideways out of the world. The ocean has always kept secrets. That is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a practical fact. The Atlantic alone covers roughly 41 million square miles of surface, and beneath that surface lies a world we still do not fully understand. Things sink into it, and are not found for centuries. Storms erase evidence. Currents carry wreckage thousands of miles from where it began. The sea does not explain itself, and it does not apologise for what it takes. It simply moves. It simply continues. And sometimes, very occasionally, it gives something back without any note attached, without any clue about what happened, without any of the answers that the people left on shore so desperately need. This is one of those times. The ship was called the Mary Celeste. She was a brigantine, a working merchant vessel, solid and unremarkable in most ways. The kind of ship that crossed the Atlantic regularly in the 1870s, carrying cargo from one port to another, without anyone paying her much attention. She had left New York in early November of 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy, with a cargo of industrial alcohol in her hold and 10 people aboard: a captain, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, a first mate, a cook, and 5 sailors. Ordinary people doing an ordinary job on an ordinary ship. And then, on December 4th, 1872, she was found. Approximately 400 miles east of the Azores, sails partially set, heading roughly toward the Strait of Gibraltar. No one at the helm, no one on deck, no one anywhere. The lifeboat was gone. The captain's logbook was still aboard. The last entry was dated November 25th, 9 days before the discovery. The cargo was untouched. The personal belongings of the crew and the captain's family were still in their cabins: a sewing machine, toys, clothing, everything that the people on board had carried with them across the ocean, left behind as if they had simply meant to step away for a moment and would be back shortly. They were not back shortly. They were never found at all. Before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? What does the world look like outside your window right now? Is it raining? Is it cold? Is there wind in the trees or just stillness? I ask because this is a story about weather, about open water, about the particular loneliness of being a long way from shore. And it helps, I think, to be aware of your own surroundings while we talk about people who lost theirs. Whatever the temperature is where you're sitting right now, I can tell you it is probably warmer and considerably more comfortable than the North Atlantic in December. And that is worth appreciating for a moment. If this is the kind of story you enjoy, the slow kind, the careful kind, the kind that takes its time and does not rush toward a tidy answer, then I would be genuinely grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to Life Beyond Scene. It is a small thing, but it helps this channel reach more people who might be looking for exactly this sort of quiet company late at night. And it means a great deal to know that these stories are finding the right listeners. Now, back to the sea. The North Atlantic in late autumn is not a friendly place. If you have never spent time on open ocean in November or December, it is difficult to fully picture what it feels like. The swells in that part of the world can reach 15, 20, sometimes 30 feet during storms. The water temperature in early December near the Azores would have been somewhere around 18 to 20 degrees Celsius on the surface. But the air above it could be much colder, especially at night, especially in wind. The sky in that region at that time of year tends to be low and grey, the horizon a smeared line between 2 different shades of the same colour. There are days when the sun barely seems to lift itself above the edge of the world before it starts going back down again. And there are nights that feel very long and very dark and very far from anything solid. This is the world the Mary Celeste was moving through. This is the world the 10 people on board woke up to every morning and went to sleep in every night. And this is the world from which they vanished. The story of the Mary Celeste is one of those rare mysteries that has genuinely never been solved. Not officially, not conclusively, not in a way that everyone agrees on. There are theories, and we will go through all of them carefully. The scientific ones, the criminal ones, the natural ones, the speculative ones. Some of them are quite convincing. One of them, in particular, fits the available evidence better than the others. But none of them can be stated as fact, because the people who knew what happened did not leave a record, and the sea did not leave one either. What makes this story so enduring and so strange is not just the disappearance, it is the completeness of it. The people on the Mary Celeste did not leave behind a single clue that pointed clearly in one direction. They left behind a ship in reasonable condition. They left behind their belongings. They left behind food and water. They left behind a logbook that ended without drama, without warning, without a final panicked entry describing what was coming. The last words in that log were routine, a position, a note about the weather, nothing unusual, and then 9 days of silence, and then a ship sailing alone across the Atlantic with no one aboard. The crew of the vessel that found her, a brigantine called the Dei Gratia, spent several hours going through the Mary Celeste after they boarded her. They were experienced sailors. They knew ships. They were looking for signs of what had happened, and what they found only deepened the confusion. The ship had not been wrecked. She had not been boarded by pirates who had stripped her of valuables. She had not caught fire. She had not been abandoned in a storm that had since passed. Everything they found pointed toward a departure that was quick, that was deliberate, and that made no sense at all given the condition of the ship and the state of the sea. That is the question that has followed this story for 150 years. Not just what happened, but why. Why would 10 people leave a seaworthy ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean? What could have frightened them so badly, or convinced them so completely, that abandoning the vessel seemed like the right choice? And where did they go? The lifeboat was gone, but the lifeboat was a small boat on a very large ocean, and no one ever found it, or them, or any trace of what became of them after they left the Mary Celeste behind. There is something in this story that touches a particular nerve in the human imagination. It is not just a maritime mystery. It is a mystery about absence, about the space where people used to be, about a young mother's sewing machine sitting in a cabin while the ship sailed on without her, about a 2-year-old child's toys left on a bunk, about a captain who was careful, experienced, and deeply sensible, who made a decision that ended with 10 people disappearing from the face of the earth. We do not know what Benjamin Briggs was thinking in his final hours on that ship. We do not know what Sarah Briggs saw or heard or felt. We do not know whether there was fear or calm or confusion, or whether they believed in the moment they stepped off the ship that they were making the right choice and that everything would be all right. We only know that it was not all right, and that the ship they left behind kept sailing. Over the course of this story, we are going to follow the Mary Celeste from her origins in Nova Scotia, through her troubled early history, through the voyage that became the most famous disappearance in maritime history, and through every theory, every investigation, every piece of evidence, and every false lead that has accumulated around her name in the century and a half since she was found. We are going to meet the people on board because they deserve to be more than a footnote. We are going to look at what the physical evidence actually says, carefully and without exaggeration. We are going to examine the theories that have been proposed, from the plausible to the peculiar, and we are going to be honest about what we know and what we do not. Because one of the things that has happened to the Mary Celeste over the years is that fiction got hold of her early and held on tight. A famous writer added details that were not real, a breakfast on the table, A cat asleep in the cabin. Final log entries full of terror. None of it was true, but all of it became part of the story that most people know. And separating the real Mary Celeste from the invented one is part of what we need to do tonight. The real story, the documented, evidenced, carefully reconstructed real story, is strange enough. It does not need embellishment. It does not need a half-eaten breakfast or a terrified final journal entry. It has a ship found sailing alone. It has 10 people gone without a trace. It has a logbook that ends on a perfectly ordinary note 9 days before the discovery. It has a lifeboat that was never found. It has a cargo that arrived in Genoa almost entirely intact. It has a rope trailing from the stern, frayed at the end. It has a sounding rod lying on the deck where it should not have been. It has 9 empty barrels in the hold. These are the facts, small, specific, physical facts. And from them, over 150 years, people have been trying to build a picture of what happened on that ship somewhere between the Azores and the open Atlantic in the last days of November 1872. Tonight, we're going to try to build that picture too, carefully, slowly, without rushing to conclusions that the evidence does not support. But first, before we can understand what happened to the Mary Celeste, we need to understand the Mary Celeste herself, not the myth, not the ghost ship of popular imagination, the actual vessel, the wood and iron and canvas and rope, where she was built, what she was built for, who owned her, who sailed her, and what kind of life she had before the voyage that made her famous. Because the Mary Celeste had a history before 1872, a long one and not a particularly fortunate one. She had been through multiple owners, at least one name change, a series of accidents and misfortunes that, in retrospect, people would look back on and call a pattern. Whether it was a pattern or simply the ordinary hard luck of a working ship in the 19th century is a question worth considering, but the history is there, and it matters, because it tells us something about the kind of vessel she was and the kind of world she operated in. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back to 1861 to a small shipbuilding community on the coast of Nova Scotia, where a brigantine was taking shape in a yard on Spencer's Island, and where no one involved in her construction had any idea what her name would eventually mean. Spencer's Island is a small place. It sits on the shore of the Minas Basin in Nova Scotia, on the upper end of the Bay of Fundy, where the tides are among the highest in the world. In the 19th century, it was a shipbuilding community, modest but skilled, the kind of place where men knew timber and water the way other people know their own streets. The yard there was not famous. It was not building grand vessels for wealthy shipping companies or naval commissions. It was building working ships, practical ships, the kind of vessel that would spend its life carrying cargo across cold water and earning its keep quietly. In 1861, the keel of a new brigantine was laid at that yard. She was built from local timber, Nova Scotia softwood, and she was given the name Amazon. Not a glamorous name for a small Canadian port, perhaps, but names on ships were often aspirational. They pointed towards something larger than the vessel itself, and Amazon was, by all accounts, a well-constructed ship. She measured approximately 103 feet in length and registered at around 282 tons. She was a brigantine, which is a specific type of two-masted sailing vessel, and it is worth pausing for a moment to picture what that actually looked like. A brigantine carries 2 masts. The forward mast, the foremast, is rigged with square sails, meaning the sails hang horizontally from yards, crossing the mast at right angles, catching the wind from behind or at an angle. The rear mast, the main mast, carries fore and aft sails, meaning they run along the length of the ship and can be angled to catch wind from the side. This combination gave a brigantine flexibility. She could make good speed running before a wind, and she could also work her way against the wind more efficiently than a fully square-rigged ship. For Atlantic crossings, carrying cargo between ports, a brigantine was a sensible choice. Not the fastest thing on the water, not the most elegant, but capable and practical. The Amazon was built for work, not spectacle. Her hull was designed for cargo. Below the main deck there was a hold large enough to take on substantial commercial loads, barrels, crates, bales, the ordinary freight of 19th century trade. The crew quarters were functional rather than comfortable, as they almost always were on working merchant vessels of this size. The captain's cabin was at the stern, slightly more private, slightly more spacious, but still a small room on a small ship in the middle of a large ocean. Everything about the Amazon was designed with a single purpose in mind: get the cargo from one place to another, arrive safely, and do it again. She was registered under British ownership initially, as Nova Scotia was still part of British North America at the time of her construction. Her first captain was a man named Robert McClellan, and here is where the troubled history begins, because McClellan fell ill almost immediately after taking command. He died shortly after the Amazon's first voyage had barely begun. This is not, on its own, a remarkable event. People died of illness with alarming frequency in the 19th century, and a captain dying young was not unheard of. But it was the first in a series of misfortunes that would follow this ship across the years, and people who tell the Mary Celeste story often point to McClellan's death as the opening note of a long, unhappy theme. The Amazon passed to a second captain, and then encountered trouble of a more physical kind. During an early voyage, she was involved in a collision with another vessel in the Strait of Dover. The damage was not catastrophic, but it required repairs and it cost money. Shortly after, she ran aground on the coast of Maine during another voyage, sustaining further damage. Again, she was repaired. Again, she returned to service. Groundings and collisions were not rare events in the age of sail. Charts were imprecise, navigation was difficult, and the sea had a way of presenting hazards at inconvenient moments. But the Amazon seemed to find more of these moments than most ships her size. She changed hands again and then again. Each transfer of ownership came with the ordinary complications of maritime commerce, debt, disagreement, legal proceedings. She was not a ship that brought her owners straightforward good fortune. By 1868, the Amazon had been through enough owners and enough misadventures that she was in poor enough condition to be sold at auction. An American buyer named Richard Haynes purchased her at a price that reflected her battered state, and the ship was taken to New York for repairs and re-registration. Under American ownership, she was renamed. The name Amazon was retired, and she became the Mary Celeste. The origin of the new name is not entirely clear. Mary Celeste was not an unusual name for a ship of the period, and the choice may have been straightforward and unremarkable. But the renaming marked a genuine transition. She was no longer a British colonial vessel with a troubled Canadian past. She was now an American merchant brigantine, refitted, repainted, and ready for a new chapter. Haynes did not keep her long. By 1872, she had passed through his hands and into those of a consortium of owners that included James Winchester, a New York shipping merchant, who held the largest share. Winchester would eventually bring in Captain Benjamin Briggs as part owner as well, which meant that when the Mary Celeste departed New York in November 1872, her captain had a financial stake in the vessel, not just a professional one. That is a detail worth holding on to. The Mary Celeste, after her American refit, was a somewhat larger vessel than she had been as the Amazon. She had been lengthened and her tonnage increased to around 282 registered tons, possibly slightly more depending on the source. Her rigging was maintained as a brigantine configuration. She was, by the time she made her final voyage, a solid, serviceable working ship. Not new, not luxurious, but sound. Witnesses who examined her after the discovery in December 1872 noted that she was in reasonable condition, her hull intact, her cargo undamaged, her provisions still aboard. She was not a ship that had been neglected or allowed to fall apart. She had been cared for. But the history of bad luck was real, even if its meaning is open to interpretation. Some people who tell this story lean heavily on the idea of a cursed ship, a vessel that seemed to attract misfortune from the moment her keel was laid. That is a tempting frame, and it is not hard to understand why. A captain dying almost immediately, collisions, groundings, multiple ownership changes, and then, finally, the most famous disappearance in maritime history. Laid out in sequence, it does look like a pattern. The more cautious interpretation is that the Amazon, and later the Mary Celeste, was simply a working ship with an ordinary working ship's history of problems, and that the final mystery has cast a retrospective shadow over everything that came before. A ship that had an uneventful career and then disappeared would still have had collisions and groundings in its past, because most ships did. The difference is that no one would have gone back and written them all down in a list. The Mary Celeste's early history has been scrutinised because of what came later, not because it was uniquely unfortunate. Both of those things can be true at the same time. The history is real. The pattern may be partly a function of hindsight, and neither interpretation changes the central question about what happened in November 1872. What the history of the ship does give us is context. It tells us that the Mary Celeste was not a new vessel on her final voyage. She had been around for 11 years by 1872. She had been repaired, rebuilt in part, renamed, and transferred between owners multiple times. She was a known quantity in the world of Atlantic merchant shipping, not a prestige vessel but a functional one. The men who sailed her knew what they were working with, and the man who commanded her on that last voyage, Captain Benjamin Briggs, was not an inexperienced sailor taking his chances on an unknown ship. He had sailed her before, he knew her. There is something worth noting about the physical character of a brigantine at sea, because it shapes how we understand the story. A ship of this size, around 100 feet long, is not a small vessel by any means, but it is not enormous either. On the open Atlantic in November she would have felt the weather. The North Atlantic in late autumn is not a gentle place. Waves can run high, winds can be strong and changeable, and the horizon is often grey and indistinct. A brigantine in those conditions requires active management. The sails need to be adjusted constantly. The pumps need to be checked regularly, because wooden ships always take on some water and the crew needs to know how much. The compass needs to be watched. The position needs to be calculated. It is not passive work. It is constant, physical, careful work. This matters because when we later examine the evidence found on the Mary Celeste after her discovery, we are examining the traces of that work. The sounding rod left on deck, the binnacle displaced, the sails partially set, the logbook open at its last entry. Each of these details tells us something about what the crew was doing, or what they were interrupted from doing in the final hours before they left the ship. Understanding the vessel helps us read those clues more clearly. The Mary Celeste's brigantine rigging also matters for another reason. A brigantine can, under certain conditions, sail herself for a period of time with no one at the helm, particularly if the sails are set in a way that creates a rough self-steering balance. This is not a reliable or precise form of navigation, but it can keep a ship moving in a general direction for hours or in favourable conditions longer. When the Dei Gratia spotted the Mary Celeste on December 4th, she was moving under partial sail, erratically but not helplessly. The fact that she'd been sailing unmanned for approximately 9 days without sinking, without running aground, and without losing her cargo is itself a testament to what a well-built working brigantine could do when left to her own devices in open water. She was not a ghost in the supernatural sense. She was a well-constructed wooden ship doing what wooden ships do, moving before the wind, riding the swells, carrying her cargo forward through the Atlantic as if nothing had changed. The absence of her crew did not stop her. It just made her strange. By the time James Winchester and his partners owned her in 1872, the Mary Celeste had become the kind of ship that experienced sailors could look at and assess quickly. She was not glamorous. She had a past. But she was functional. She was loaded with a valuable cargo, and she had a careful captain at her helm. Whatever reputation she carried from her years as the Amazon, whatever whispers might have followed her through the shipyards and counting houses of New York, she was considered seaworthy. She was considered ready. and so in the autumn of 1872 she was prepared for a transatlantic voyage. The cargo was loaded, the provisions were stowed, the crew was assembled, and Captain Briggs made his final arrangements in New York before departure. He wrote letters to his family. He made sure the ship was in order. He was by all accounts meticulous about these things. The Mary Celeste was ready. The question of what she was ready for is the one that has never been fully answered. But before we can follow her out of New York Harbour and into the Atlantic, we need to meet the people who were on board, because the ship is only part of this story. The other part is the 10 human beings who stepped onto her deck in November 1872 and were never seen again, and they deserve more than a list of names. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs was 37 years old in the autumn of 1872, and by any reasonable measure he was a man at the height of his career. He had been sailing since his early 20s, working his way up through the merchant fleet with the kind of steady, unhurried competence that earns a man a good reputation without necessarily making him famous. He was from Wareham, Massachusetts, born into a seafaring family in 1835. His father had been a sea captain. 2 of his brothers were sea captains. The sea was not a romantic adventure for the Briggs family. It was a profession, passed down and practiced with the same seriousness that other families applied to medicine or law. He was known as a careful man, disciplined, deeply religious, in the quiet, practiced way of someone who actually believes what he says, rather than simply performing belief for company. He did not allow alcohol on his ships, which was not unheard of, but was not universal either. Some captains looked the other way when it came to a crew's drinking habits, particularly on long ocean passages where morale needed managing. Briggs did not. He ran a sober ship, and the men who sailed with him knew that before they signed on. Whether this was a source of friction or simply an accepted condition of employment is hard to say from this distance, but there is no record of it causing serious trouble. The men who sailed under him generally regarded him as fair. Strict, yes, but fair. He had commanded several vessels before the Mary Celeste, including the schooner Forest King and the brig Arthur, and he had developed a reputation not just for competence, but for the kind of calm judgment that matters most when things go wrong at sea. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who made reckless decisions. This is worth holding on to, because when we later try to understand why the Mary Celeste was abandoned, the character of her captain is one of the most important pieces of evidence we have. Whatever caused 10 people to leave that ship, it was enough to convince Benjamin Briggs that leaving was the right thing to do. And Briggs was not easily convinced of reckless things. He had a personal stake in this voyage that went beyond his salary. He had invested his own money in the Mary Celeste, purchasing a partial ownership share before the voyage. This was not unusual for captains of his era, but it meant the ship was partly his in a real financial sense. He had reasons beyond professional duty to see her safely to Genoa. He was not a hired hand following someone else's orders. He was, in part, sailing his own vessel. That detail matters when we consider the insurance fraud theories that would later circulate, because a man who has put his own money into a ship has less reason to abandon it than a man who has not. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, was 30 years old, and she was not a woman who stayed home while her husband sailed. She had made ocean passages before and had chosen to join Benjamin on this voyage, bringing with her their youngest child, a daughter named Sophia Matilda, who was 2 years old. Sarah was educated and musical. She played the melodeon, a small keyboard instrument, and she had brought it with her on board. She wrote letters that have survived, and they give us something rare in this story, a direct human voice from inside the Mary Celeste in the days before departure. Her letters to her mother-in-law are warm and ordinary. She writes about the weather in New York, about Sophia's health, about the cargo being loaded, about looking forward to the voyage. There is nothing in those letters that suggests fear or foreboding. She sounds like a capable, contented woman preparing for a long sea journey, with the practical cheerfulness of someone who has done this kind of thing before. Their older son Arthur, 7 years old, was not on the ship. He had been left behind in Massachusetts with his grandmother. This was a practical decision. A transatlantic voyage was not a comfortable experience for a young child, and the family presumably intended to return. Arthur would grow up without his father. He would spend decades wondering what happened on that ship. He outlived the mystery by many years, and by all accounts the not knowing was its own kind of grief, different from the grief of a confirmed death, but no less real. The first mate was Albert G. Richardson, and he was by all accounts a solid, experienced sailor. He was 35 years old, from Stockton Springs, Maine. He had sailed on various vessels and had worked his way up to the position of first mate through demonstrated ability. He was engaged to be married, which is one of those small biographical details that makes a historical disappearance feel particularly sharp. He had a future planned. He had reasons to come home. The ship's cook was Edward William Head, 23 years old, from New York. He was newly married, having wed just before the voyage. His wife remained in New York. He was the youngest of the named crew members in terms of his personal circumstances, if not in age, a man just starting his adult life who had taken a job on a merchant ship to earn his way. The remaining 5 sailors were Volkert Lorenzen, Bos Lorenzen, Arian Martens, Gottlieb Gonderschalk, and Adrian Lorenzen. 3 of them shared the surname Lorenzen, which suggests they may have been related, or at least came from the same tight-knit community. They were German, from the North Frisian Islands off the coast of what is now northern Germany and Denmark. This part of the world had a long tradition of sending its men to sea, and German sailors were common on Atlantic merchant vessels of this period. They were working sailors, hired hands with the skills needed for a transatlantic passage on a brigantine. We know less about them individually than we know about Briggs or Richardson, partly because they left fewer written records and partly because the investigation that followed the discovery focused more on the officers than on the ordinary crew. 10 people in total. 2 of them children, in a sense, though Sophia was very young and Arthur was safely at home. 8 adults, of whom at least 4 were experienced sailors with years of Atlantic passage behind them. This was not a crew of nervous novices. It was not a group of men and a family who had stumbled onto a ship they didn't understand. They knew the sea. They knew the vessel. They had made their preparations carefully. One thing that is easy to overlook when reading about the Mary Celeste is how small the social world of the ship actually was. 10 people on a vessel roughly 100 feet long on an ocean crossing that would take several weeks under normal conditions. There was very little privacy. The captain and his family had the stern cabin, which was the most spacious quarters on board, but it was still a modest space by any land-based standard. The crew lived forward in the forecastle, a cramped area in the bow of the ship where the men slept in bunks and stored their personal belongings. Meals were prepared in the galley, a small enclosed cooking area. Everyone was within earshot of everyone else for most of the day. This closeness matters because it makes certain theories harder to sustain. A mutiny on a ship of this size would have been a violent, audible, physical event. There would have been evidence. A secret arrangement between the captain and some of the crew to abandon the ship would have required the cooperation or the silencing of everyone else on board, including a 2-year-old child and her mother. The more you think about the human reality of 10 people living together on a small ship, the more some of the dramatic theories begin to strain against the simple fact of space and proximity. Briggs had sailed with some of these men before, or had at least taken care in selecting them. There is a letter he wrote to his mother shortly before departure, dated October 3rd, 1872, in which he mentions the crew and expresses general satisfaction with the arrangements. He writes that he hopes they will have a good voyage, and that the cargo seems to be in order. It is a letter written in the tone of a man who is organised and calm, not a man who is worried about his crew or his ship. He sounds, in short, like himself, careful, measured, quietly confident. Sarah Briggs also wrote to her mother-in-law in the days before departure. In one letter, she mentions that little Sophia is well, and that the weather in New York has been pleasant. She mentions the melodeon, which she was hoping to play during the voyage. She writes about looking forward to seeing Genoa, though she had not been there before. She asks after Arthur, the son left behind, and sends her love. Reading those letters now, knowing what comes next, is a quietly unsettling experience. Not because they contain any dark hints or premonitions, but precisely because they do not. They are entirely ordinary. They are the letters of a woman who expected to arrive somewhere. The crew signed on at New York in late October and early November 1872. The loading of the cargo took time, as it always did, and there were the usual delays of a busy commercial port. The Mary Celeste was not the only ship in New York Harbour preparing for an Atlantic crossing that autumn. The docks were busy with the ordinary commerce of the age. Other ships were loading, departing, arriving. The Dei Gratia, another brigantine that will become central to this story, was also in New York around the same time, preparing for her own voyage to Gibraltar. Her captain, David Morehouse, knew Benjamin Briggs. The two men had met before, possibly shared a meal in New York in the days before their respective departures. The world of Atlantic merchant shipping in 1872 was not a large one. The same names and faces appeared repeatedly across different vessels and different ports. By the time the Mary Celeste was ready to sail, everything appeared to be in order. The cargo was secured below, the provisions were loaded, the navigational instruments were in place, the ship had been checked and found seaworthy. Briggs had done what a careful captain does. He had prepared for the voyage as thoroughly as his experience and resources allowed. He had no reason to believe this crossing would be different from the others he had made. The 10 people who walked onto that ship in early November 1872 were ordinary people doing an ordinary thing by the standards of their time. They were not adventurers seeking fame or explorers pushing into unmapped territory. They were working people crossing a well-travelled ocean on a well-understood route, carrying a commercial cargo for a fee. The Atlantic had been crossed thousands of times by then. Steam-powered ships were beginning to change the nature of ocean travel, but brigantines like the Mary Celeste were still common and still reliable. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the voyage they were undertaking. What makes their disappearance so difficult to accept even now is partly this ordinariness. If they had been reckless, if Briggs had been a drunk or a fool, if the ship had been in poor condition, if the weather had been known to be dangerous, there would be easier explanations available. But they were not reckless. Briggs was neither a drunk nor a fool. The ship was in reasonable condition, and the weather, as far as the log records show, had not been catastrophic. These were careful, experienced people on a functional vessel, and they vanished completely. No bodies, no survivors, no message, no explanation that has ever been proven beyond doubt. The human weight of that is considerable when you let yourself feel it. 10 people, several of them with families waiting at home, one of them a small child who had barely started her life. All of them gone somewhere in the North Atlantic in the autumn and early winter of 1872. Whatever happened on that ship, it happened to real people, with real names and real futures that were cut short. The mystery is compelling, yes, but underneath the mystery there is a loss, and that loss deserves to be acknowledged before we follow the Mary Celeste out of New York Harbour and into the Atlantic, because that is where the story goes next. The preparations are complete, the crew is assembled, the cargo is loaded, and Captain Briggs is ready to sail. The Mary Celeste will leave New York on November the 7th, 1872, bound for Genoa with 1,701 barrels of alcohol in her hold and 10 people on her deck. The voyage ahead is a long one, several thousand miles across an ocean that does not always behave itself in November. But Briggs has made this kind of crossing before. He knows what to expect. He has his wife beside him, his daughter in the cabin below, and a crew he has reason to trust. The ship moves out of the harbour and into open water, and for a little while, everything is as it should be. The Mary Celeste left New York Harbour on November the 7th, 1872. It was a Thursday. The weather that day was reportedly fair, the kind of early November morning that still holds a trace of autumn before the cold settles in properly. The harbour would have been busy with the usual commerce of a major port city, other ships moving in and out, The sounds of loading and unloading, the calls of dock workers, the smell of salt water and rope and timber. The Mary Celeste slipped out among all of that and headed east, toward the open Atlantic, toward Genoa, toward a voyage that should have taken roughly 3 to 4 weeks under reasonable conditions. The route was a familiar one for merchant vessels of the era. From New York, a brigantine bound for the Mediterranean would typically sail east and slightly south, taking advantage of prevailing winds and currents, passing south of Newfoundland, crossing the Atlantic at a latitude that kept the worst of the North Atlantic weather at a manageable distance, and then entering the Strait of Gibraltar before turning northeast toward the Italian coast. It was not a short journey, but it was a well-travelled one. The Atlantic crossing had been made by hundreds of ships every year by 1872. The route was understood, the hazards were known, the navigation was demanding but not exotic. The cargo was the most commercially significant thing on board. 1,701 barrels of commercial denatured alcohol, owned by a firm called Meissner Ackermann and Company, valued at approximately $35,000 at the time. To put that in some kind of perspective, that was a substantial sum in 1872, roughly equivalent to several $100,000 in modern terms, though exact conversions across that much time are always imprecise. The alcohol was industrial grade, sometimes described in the records as crude ethyl alcohol. It was not drinkable in any practical sense, not something a sailor could tap into for an evening's entertainment. It was destined for industrial use in Italy, where it would be used in the production of fortified wines, among other things. The cargo had been loaded carefully and secured in the hold. It was heavy, dense cargo, the kind that gives a ship good ballast and keeps her stable in moderate seas. Briggs had written to his mother on October 3rd, 1872, before the loading was even complete, and the letter is warm and businesslike in equal measure. He mentions the ship, the upcoming voyage, his satisfaction with the general arrangements. He writes about Sarah and Sophia in affectionate terms. He does not express any anxiety about the journey ahead. His second letter, written closer to departure, has a similarly calm tone. These letters have survived, and historians have quoted from them repeatedly, because they are among the last direct records of Benjamin Briggs's voice. They are useful documents, but they are also poignant ones. A man writing to his mother before a voyage he does not know he will not complete. Sarah Briggs also wrote letters before departure. She was a well-educated woman, the daughter of a minister, and her letters are articulate and warm. She mentions the melodeon, a small keyboard instrument she had brought on board, intending to play it during the long evenings at sea. She mentions the weather in New York, the state of little Sophia's health, her thoughts about the voyage ahead. She had sailed with her husband before, and she was not a nervous traveller. The letters do not read like the letters of a woman who had any premonition of trouble. They read like the letters of a woman who expected to arrive in Genoa and write home from there. The ship departed with 10 people on board. Captain Briggs, Sarah, Sophia, First Mate Albert Richardson, Cook Edward Head, and 5 sailors: Volkert Lorenzen, Bos Lorenzen, Arian Martens, Gottlieb Gondeschalk, and Adrian Lorenzen. The Lorenzen brothers, Volkert and Bos, were from Germany, as were several of the other sailors. This was entirely common for Atlantic merchant vessels of the period. Crews were often multinational, drawn from whatever pool of experienced sailors was available at the port of departure. For the first several weeks, the voyage appears to have gone reasonably well, or at least there is nothing in the surviving records to suggest otherwise. The ship's log, which was kept by the first mate as well as by Briggs himself, records the vessel's daily position, the weather conditions, and other navigational notes. These entries are largely routine. There are no dramatic entries describing storms, mechanical failures, or crew disputes. The ship moved east across the Atlantic at the pace that a brigantine of her size and rigging could manage, under the conditions typical of that time of year. Some days would have been faster than others. November in the North Atlantic is not the most forgiving month for sailing, but it is navigable, and experienced sailors expected to deal with some rough weather. The last entry in the official log is dated November 24th, 1872, and places the Mary Celeste north of the Azores. The last entry on the mate's slate log, which was a separate record kept on a chalkboard and transferred periodically to the official log, is dated November the 25th, 1872. This entry records the ship's position as approximately 6 miles northwest of Santa Maria Island, the southernmost island in the Azores archipelago. The position was noted carefully, as it always was, with latitude and longitude recorded. The entry is ordinary. There is no indication of distress, no note of unusual weather, no mention of any problem with the ship or the crew. After November 25th, the log goes silent. There are no more entries. Whatever happened to the 10 people on board the Mary Celeste, it happened somewhere in the vicinity of the Azores, or shortly after the ship left that position. The last known moment of the voyage, as far as the written record is concerned, is a position note on a slate board, made on a November morning in 1872, somewhere near a small island in the middle of the Atlantic. The Azores are a Portuguese archipelago sitting in the mid-Atlantic, roughly a third of the way between Europe and North America. They are volcanic islands, dramatic in appearance, surrounded by deep water. The sea around them is not always calm. The region is seismically active, which becomes relevant when we consider some of the theories about what happened. The islands were a common waypoint for Atlantic voyages in the 19th century, a place to take on fresh water, make repairs, or simply confirm one's position before the final push toward Europe. The Mary Celeste was not stopping there, as far as anyone knows. She was simply passing through the region, using the islands as a navigational reference point before continuing northeast toward the Strait of Gibraltar. It is worth pausing here for a moment to think about what the voyage would have actually felt like from the inside. A brigantine like the Mary Celeste was not a large ship. She was about 103 feet long, which sounds reasonable until you consider that this was the entire world for 10 people for weeks at a time. The captain's cabin at the stern would have been the most comfortable space, and Briggs shared it with Sarah and Sophia. It was small by any modern standard, but it was private and it contained the family's belongings, Sarah's sewing things, Sophia's toys, the melodeon, the books, and personal items that made a long voyage bearable. The crew would have slept in the forward part of the ship, in quarters that were functional rather than comfortable. The cook, Edward Head, would have worked in the galley preparing meals for everyone on board. Life on a merchant vessel in 1872 was not glamorous, but it had its own rhythm. The watches rotated, the sails were adjusted as conditions changed, the log was kept, the position was calculated each day using the chronometer and the sextant. Meals were prepared and eaten. In quiet moments, the crew would have had time to talk, to rest, to maintain the rigging and the equipment. Sarah might have played the melodeon in the evenings. Sophia, at 2 years old, would have been a small presence at the centre of the ship's domestic life, probably a source of some amusement and affection for the crew. It is a strangely intimate picture when you let yourself imagine it. 10 people in a small wooden ship, moving slowly across an enormous ocean, going about the ordinary business of a long voyage. The Dei Gratia, the ship that would eventually find the Mary Celeste, had left New York about 8 days after her on November 15th, 1872. She was also a brigantine, also bound for Gibraltar, also carrying a commercial cargo. Her captain, David Morehouse, was an experienced Atlantic sailor who knew Benjamin Briggs. The two men had almost certainly met in New York in the days before their respective departures. Some accounts suggest they shared a meal together, though this detail, like several others in this story, exists in the territory between documented fact and reasonable inference. What is documented is that Morehouse knew Briggs and that the two ships were on similar routes across the same ocean at roughly the same time. The Dei Gratia was a faster ship, or at least she made better time on this particular crossing, because she was the one that spotted the Mary Celeste on December 4th, 1872, sailing erratically about 400 miles east of the Azores. But that discovery is the next part of the story. Before we reach it, it is worth staying with the silence for a moment. The Mary Celeste's log ends on November 25th. She was found on December 4th. That is 9 days during which we have no record of anything that happened on board. 9 days during which 10 people vanished from a ship that was still sailing. The ship herself was still moving, still heading generally in the right direction, still carrying her cargo, still largely intact. But the people were gone. 9 days is long enough for a great many things to happen at sea. It is long enough for a serious storm, a sudden mechanical crisis, a medical emergency, a fire, an explosion, a collision, or a simple catastrophic failure of judgment. It is also long enough for the Atlantic to erase any trace of what happened. The ocean does not keep evidence well. Wooden debris drifts and sinks. Bodies in the North Atlantic do not last long. If the crew of the Mary Celeste ended up in the water, in the open Atlantic in November, the outcome would have been swift, and the sea would have kept the secret efficiently. What we know is this. On November 25th, 1872, the Mary Celeste was near the Azores. Her crew was alive and functioning, and someone was keeping the log. On December 4th, 1872, she was found 400 miles to the east. Her crew gone, her lifeboat missing, her cargo largely untouched, and her log silent for 9 days. The distance between those two facts is not just geographical. It is the distance between a normal voyage and one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. The cargo, those 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, was sitting in the hold when the ship was found. Most of it was intact. But when the Mary Celeste finally arrived in Genoa, after being sailed there by a salvage crew, 9 of the barrels were found to be empty. This detail, which seems minor at first glance, turns out to be one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. Those 9 barrels were made of red oak rather than white oak. Red oak is a more porous wood, less suitable for containing liquid cargo. The alcohol had seeped through, or evaporated, or both. And the implications of that in a confined ship's hold are something we will come back to in careful detail later in this story. For now, the Mary Celeste is somewhere in the North Atlantic, east of the Azores, sailing without a crew. The Dei Gratia is still a day or two away from finding her, and somewhere behind us, in New York, a 7-year-old boy named Arthur Briggs is staying with his grandmother, waiting for his parents and his little sister to come home from Genoa. He will wait a long time, and they will not come, but the ship, the empty ship, will keep sailing east, as if she has somewhere to be. The morning of December 4th, 1872, was grey and cold over the North Atlantic, the way mornings tend to be in that part of the ocean at that time of year. The Dei Gratia was making reasonable progress eastward, her crew going about the ordinary business of a mid-ocean passage. Captain David Morehouse was experienced enough to read the sea and sky without much conscious effort, the way any sailor who has spent years on the Atlantic develops a kind of background awareness of the water around him. And so when something on the horizon began to look wrong, he noticed it. The vessel he could see was moving oddly. That is the simplest way to describe it. A ship under sail has a certain purposeful character, even at a distance. The way she sits in the water, the angle of her sails, the steadiness of her heading, all of it communicates something to a trained eye. What Morehouse saw was a ship that did not look purposeful. She was yawing, swinging off course and back again, the way a vessel moves when there is no one at the helm to correct her. Her sails were only partially set, and not in a configuration that suggested deliberate seamanship. She was not in distress in the dramatic sense. She was not sinking, not on fire, not flying a distress signal. She was just drifting, more or less, with a kind of aimless momentum that made no sense for a working merchant vessel in the middle of the ocean. Morehouse brought the Dei Gratia closer. The ship he was looking at was the Mary Celeste, and he would have recognised her. She was a brigantine of similar type to his own vessel, and he knew her captain. As the Dei Gratia drew nearer, the picture became stranger rather than clearer. The Mary Celeste appeared to be intact. Her hull was sound. She was not taking on water in any visible way, but there was no movement on deck. No one came to the rail to look back at the approaching ship. No one adjusted the sails or corrected the helm. The Mary Celeste simply continued her erratic, crewless progress through the grey Atlantic water. Morehouse sent his first mate, Oliver Deveau, across to investigate. Deveau was a careful, experienced sailor, and his account of what he found when he boarded the Mary Celeste is the most detailed first-hand record we have of the ship's condition. He brought 2 other men with him in a small boat, and they climbed aboard a vessel that was, by all appearances, in the middle of a voyage that no one was sailing. The deck was wet and somewhat cluttered, but not wrecked. The rigging had suffered some damage, one of the rails on the upper deck had been knocked away, and some of the running rigging was in disarray. The main staysail was found lying on the deck rather than set properly. The 4 lower topsail had been blown away, or had come loose, or both. The binnacle, the housing that protects the compass, had been displaced and damaged. The wheel was unmanned and had been left to spin freely. And the lifeboat, the yawl that would normally have been secured on deck, was gone. Not washed away in any obvious sense, not smashed or broken. Just gone. The davits, the small crane-like fittings used to lower and raise the lifeboat, showed signs that the boat had been launched or at least removed deliberately. Deveau went below. The main hatch was open. The forward hatch was open as well, and the skylight over the main cabin was also open, which meant that rain and sea spray had been getting in for some time. There was standing water between the decks, roughly 3.5 feet of it in the hold, which sounds alarming but was not necessarily catastrophic for a ship that had been unmanned for over a week in the North Atlantic. The pumps were functional, or at least one of them was. The other had been partially disassembled, its casing removed and its inner workings exposed, as if someone had been in the process of checking it or repairing it when they stopped. The cargo was there. All those barrels of industrial alcohol stacked in the hold, still secured, still largely intact. The ship's provisions were also still aboard. Food, fresh water, adequate supplies for a long voyage. The crew had not eaten the ship bare before leaving. They had not taken the food with them. Whatever reason they had for leaving, hunger was not part of it. In the captain's cabin, Deveau found the Briggs family's belongings exactly as they had been left. Sarah Briggs's sewing machine was there. Sophia's toys were there, the family's clothing, their books, their personal effects, all of it still present, undisturbed. The ship's papers were missing, which is notable, because a captain would normally take the ship's papers if he was abandoning the vessel in an organised way. The chronometer and sextant were also gone, the navigational instruments that would have been essential if the crew intended to find their way somewhere in the lifeboat. The fact that they took the navigational tools suggests that whoever left the ship intended to navigate. They were not simply swept overboard or taken by surprise in the middle of the night. Someone had made a decision, or at least had time to gather certain things before leaving. The logbook was still there. Deveau found it in the mate's cabin. The last entry was dated November 25th, 1872. It recorded the ship's position as approximately 6 miles northwest of Santa Maria Island in the Azores. After that, nothing. 9 days of silence, and then Deveau standing in the cabin reading the final words written by someone who was no longer on board. What struck Deveau and the other men, and what has struck everyone who has studied this case in the century and a half since, was not the damage or the disorder. It was the absence of any clear reason for the departure. The ship was not sinking. The cargo was intact. The food was there. The personal belongings of the captain's family, a young woman and a 2-year-old child, were still in the cabin, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment. There was no sign of a fight, no blood that could be confirmed, no broken furniture, no bodies, no obvious violence. Whatever had happened, it had not destroyed the ship, and it had not apparently left any dramatic physical mark on her interior. Deveau and his 2 companions spent several hours on board, assessing the situation. They found the sounding rod, the instrument used to measure the depth of water in the hold, lying on deck rather than stored in its proper place. This suggested that someone had been using it shortly before the ship was abandoned, checking how much water had accumulated below. The fact that it was left on deck rather than put away reinforces the sense of a departure that was hurried, or at least not fully orderly. Deveau made a decision. He sent one man back to the Dei Gratia to report to Morehouse, and he and the remaining crew member stayed on the Mary Celeste. The plan was to sail her to Gibraltar, which was the nearest British port and the appropriate place to bring a salvaged vessel. This was not a simple undertaking for two men on a brigantine, but Deveau was a capable sailor and the Mary Celeste was, despite everything, still a functional ship. He pumped out the water in the hold, sorted the rigging as best he could, set the sails properly and began the passage to Gibraltar. The Dei Gratia sailed alongside or nearby for most of the journey. They arrived in Gibraltar on December 13th, 1872, 9 days after the discovery, which is a number that keeps appearing in this story in different forms. The Mary Celeste was brought into port and the British authorities were notified. The ship was placed under the jurisdiction of the Vice Admiralty Court, and an official investigation began almost immediately. Now, it is worth pausing here for a moment, because the discovery itself, the physical act of boarding the Mary Celeste and finding what Deveau found, is actually one of the cleaner, better documented parts of this whole story. Devoe's testimony was detailed and consistent. He was a professional who knew what he was looking at, and his account of the ship's condition has held up reasonably well under scrutiny over the years. The picture he painted was not one of catastrophe or violence. It was one of sudden, unexplained departure. A ship in working condition, provisions intact, personal belongings left behind, navigational instruments taken, lifeboat gone, log silent for 9 days. The rope is worth mentioning separately, because it is one of the details that tends to get overlooked. Hanging from the stern of the Mary Celeste was a long rope, frayed at the end. It was trailing in the water behind the ship. One interpretation of this rope is that it was a line the crew had used to attach the lifeboat to the ship after they abandoned her. The idea would be that the crew took to the lifeboat but stayed connected to the Mary Celeste by this line, perhaps intending to reboard her once whatever had frightened them had passed. If the line then broke, or was cut, or simply frayed under the strain of the lifeboat pulling against the moving ship, the crew would have found themselves adrift in the open Atlantic with no way back to the vessel. That is a bleak picture. A small lifeboat in the North Atlantic in late November, with 10 people on board, the ship they had just left receding in the distance, and no way to reach her again. It is only a theory, of course. The rope could have been there for other reasons. Ropes trail from ships for all sorts of purposes, but the frayed end does suggest tension and separation, rather than a rope that was simply left coiled and forgotten. And the image it creates, the Mary Celeste sailing on alone while the people who had been aboard her drifted away in the opposite direction, is consistent with everything else the physical evidence suggests. Devoe's account also noted that there was no sign of fire on board, no burn marks, no charring, no evidence that anything had caught light in the hold or the galley. This is an important detail, and it becomes more important when you consider the nature of the cargo. 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol in a ship's hold is not a comfortable thing to think about in terms of fire risk. But the Mary Celeste showed no evidence of having burned. Whatever had happened in that hold, it had not left visible fire damage. The ship was intact, the wood was unscorched, and the cargo, though 9 barrels would later be found empty, was physically undamaged. The galley was another point of interest. Accounts differ somewhat on what exactly was found there. Some early reports described a meal that appeared to have been recently prepared, or even interrupted mid-preparation. This is one of the details that Arthur Conan Doyle would later amplify considerably in his fictional version of the story, describing a half-eaten breakfast on the table as if the crew had simply vanished mid-bite. The actual evidence is considerably less dramatic. There was food on board, and the galley appeared to have been in use, but there is no reliable contemporary account of a freshly cooked meal sitting abandoned at a set table. That image belongs to the legend, not to Devoe's testimony. What was found was a functional galley with provisions, not a tableau of interrupted domesticity. All of this, the displaced binnacle, the missing lifeboat, the trailing rope, the sounding rod on deck, the open hatches, the missing navigational instruments, the silent log, adds up to a picture of a ship that was left behind in a hurry, but not in a panic so complete that nothing was taken. Someone made decisions. Someone took the papers and the instruments. Someone, presumably, organised the departure well enough to get 10 people into a lifeboat. But whatever drove that decision happened fast enough that Sarah Briggs's sewing machine was left in the cabin, and Sophia's toys were left on the shelf, and the food was left in the galley, and the cargo was left in the hold, and the log was left open at November 25th with nothing written after it. The Mary Celeste was found sailing eastward, toward the Strait of Gibraltar, in reasonable condition, 9 days after her crew had gone. She'd covered roughly 400 miles in those 9 days, which is consistent with the Atlantic currents and the partial sail configuration that Devoe found when he boarded her. She had not run aground, she had not been wrecked. She had simply continued alone in roughly the right direction, as if the ocean itself had decided to deliver her. Devoe sailed her the rest of the way. And when she arrived in Gibraltar, the questions began in earnest. Official questions with a court and a suspicious attorney general, and an investigation that would last months and produce no satisfying conclusions. The man who led that investigation, a Gibraltar official named Solly Flood, had already made up his mind before the testimony was finished. He was certain that something criminal had happened on that ship, and he was equally certain that the crew of the Dei Gratia knew more about it than they were saying. He was wrong on both counts, as far as the evidence goes, but his suspicions shaped the entire official response to the discovery and cast a long shadow over the people who had found the ship and tried to do the right thing with her. What the Gibraltar inquiry found, what it missed, and why it ended without an answer is where the story goes next. The Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar on December 13th, 1872. Oliver Devoe and a small crew from the Dei Gratia had sailed her in, a journey of several days from the point of discovery, navigating a vessel they did not know, with a hold full of industrial alcohol and a mystery they could not explain. She was brought into port, tied up and handed over to the authorities, and that in a sense is where the trouble really started. The British Vice Admiralty Court at Gibraltar took charge of the proceedings almost immediately. The man who had come to define the entire investigation was Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar and the proctor for the Queen in her Office of Admiralty. That is a long title. The authority it carried was real. Flood was not a minor official. He was experienced, well-connected, and accustomed to maritime cases. He was also, from the very beginning, convinced that something criminal had taken place aboard the Mary Celeste, and that conviction coloured everything he did over the months that followed. Flood examined the ship personally. He walked her decks, inspected the hold, looked through the cabins, and came away not with questions but with a theory. He believed that the crew of the Mary Celeste had been murdered. He believed more specifically that the crew of the Dei Gratia was involved. His reasoning was this: the Dei Gratia had left New York only a week after the Mary Celeste. The two captains, Briggs and Morehouse, knew each other. The Dei Gratia had found the Mary Celeste in a condition that seemed too orderly for a genuine emergency, and the salvage claim that Morehouse and his crew were now making stood to earn them a considerable sum of money if it was accepted. To Flood, this smelled wrong. It smelled like a scheme. He commissioned a survey of the ship, and the surveyors came back with findings that seemed, at first, to support his suspicions. On the deck of the Mary Celeste, they found what appeared to be reddish-brown stains. Below deck, in the captain's quarters, they found a sword, an old Italian sword of no particular value, and on the blade there were marks that the initial examiners described as possibly blood-stained. There were also marks on the bow of the ship, near the waterline, that looked to Flood like deliberate cuts made by an axe or a sharp tool. Taken together, He believed these details pointed to a violent struggle, a massacre, and a cover-up. He wrote letters to the Board of Trade in London laying out his theory. He was not tentative about it. He described the marks on the bow as evidence of a deliberate attempt to make the ship appear damaged by accident. He described the sword as a weapon that had been used and then hastily wiped. He described the stains on the deck as blood. He was certain, or at least he wrote, as if he were certain, and certainty in an official report carries weight. The problem was that the evidence did not hold up. The sword was examined more carefully. The marks on it were not blood. They appeared to be rust, combined with some kind of residue that was consistent with the blade having been stored improperly. Dr. J. Patron, a Gibraltar physician who examined the stains, concluded they were not human blood. Further analysis of the stains found on the deck produced the same result. They were not blood. They were never confirmed to be blood by any credible examination. The reddish colour that had alarmed Flood and his surveyors had a more mundane explanation, most likely something related to the ship's cargo, or simply the natural discoloration of wood that had been exposed to salt water and weather over a period of days. The marks on the bow were similarly inconclusive. They were real marks, genuine cuts in the wood, but their origin could not be definitively established. Ships accumulate damage. A merchant vessel working the Atlantic in 1872 would have sustained minor impacts, scrapes and wear from routine operations. The cuts on the bow of the Mary Celeste were unusual enough to note, but not deep enough, not positioned correctly enough, and not accompanied by any other evidence that would support the idea of deliberate sabotage. Most later analysts have concluded they were probably caused by the ship's movement through the water in the days after abandonment, or possibly by debris. None of this stopped Flood. He continued to press his theory, continued to hold the Day Greater crew in Gibraltar, and continued to delay the salvage proceedings. Morehouse and his men had been expecting a straightforward, if modest, salvage award. Instead, they found themselves under a cloud of suspicion, unable to leave Gibraltar, their ship idle, their livelihoods on hold while Flood pursued a theory that the physical evidence was steadily dismantling. The inquiry heard testimony from Oliver Deveau in considerable detail. Deveau was the first mate of the Dei Gratia, the man who had led the boarding party onto the Mary Celeste, and who had then sailed her to Gibraltar. His account was careful and consistent. He described what he had found on the ship, the state of the rigging, the condition of the cargo, the personal belongings in the cabins, the missing lifeboat, the logbook, the sounding rod on the deck. He described the ship as seaworthy but clearly abandoned. He said there was no sign of violence. He said there was no sign of fire. He said the ship appeared to have been left in a hurry but not in chaos. Flood found Devoe's testimony suspicious precisely because it was so calm and orderly. A genuine mystery, Flood seemed to feel, should produce more confusion. The fact that Deveau could describe the scene so clearly, could account for so many details, struck Flood as evidence of rehearsal rather than honest recollection. This is a frustrating kind of logic to argue against, because it turns competence into evidence of guilt. Deveau knew what he had seen because he had seen it. But Flood read his clarity as a sign that he had prepared his story in advance. Captain Morehouse himself gave testimony. He described the sighting of the Mary Celeste on December 4th, the decision to investigate, and the discovery that the ship was unmanned. He confirmed that he and Briggs had known each other in New York before the voyage, that they had dined together, that they were on friendly terms. Flood, predictably, treated this friendship not as an ordinary fact of life among merchant captains, but as circumstantial evidence of conspiracy. The inquiry also heard from the surveyors who had examined the ship, and their testimony was the most technically detailed. They described the displaced binnacle, the missing navigational instruments, the state of the rigging, the water in the hold, the condition of the cargo. Their findings were consistent with Devoe's account in almost every particular. The ship had been in a sailable condition when found. The cargo was largely intact. There was no sign of fire or structural damage. The lifeboat was gone. The log was silent after November 25th. What the surveyors could not explain, and what the inquiry could not resolve, was why. Why had the crew left? What had happened in the 9 days between the last log entry and the discovery? Where were the 10 people who had been on board? These questions sat at the centre of the proceedings and stayed there, unanswered throughout. Flood eventually submitted his findings to the Board of Trade. His conclusion was, in essence, that something criminal had happened but that he could not prove what it was. He suspected the Dei Gratia crew. He suspected the cargo owners. He suspected a conspiracy of some kind. But suspicion without evidence is not a verdict, and the court could not act on suspicion alone. The proceedings dragged on into early 1873 without producing a definitive finding of wrongdoing against anyone. The salvage award that was eventually granted to Morehouse and his crew was deeply disappointing. The Mary Celeste and her cargo were valued at somewhere above £6,000 for the purposes of the salvage calculation. The Dei Gratia crew received approximately £1,700, which was a fraction of what a salvage of that kind would normally have earned. The low award was a direct consequence of Flood's suspicions. The court had not found the Dei Gratia crew guilty of anything, but the taint of suspicion was enough to reduce their reward substantially. They had done their jobs, sailed a derelict vessel safely into port, preserved the ship and her cargo, and they were paid as if they were lucky not to have been charged with a crime. It is difficult not to feel some frustration on their behalf when you look at it plainly. Morehouse and DeVoe and the rest of the Dei Gratia crew were, as far as the evidence goes, entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. They spotted a ship in distress, they boarded her, they sailed her to safety, and they reported everything they found honestly and accurately. Their reward was months of detention, sustained official suspicion, and a salvage payment that did not come close to reflecting the value of what they had done. Flood, for his part, never fully abandoned his theory. He continued to believe, or at least to assert, that the mystery of the Mary Celeste had a criminal explanation. He wrote about the case for years afterward, maintaining that the evidence pointed to foul play, even as the specific pieces of that evidence, the sword, the stains, the marks on the bow, were progressively shown to be less significant than he had claimed. He became, in a way, more invested in his theory than in the truth of the matter, which is a recognisable human tendency, but not a particularly useful one in an official investigation. What the Gibraltar inquiry left behind was not a conclusion, but a framework of suspicion that would colour discussions of the Mary Celeste for decades. Because Flood had raised the possibility of murder and conspiracy, and because those possibilities were never definitively disproven, they were only unsupported. They remained in circulation as live theories long after the physical evidence had been examined and found wanting. The inquiry had done the opposite of what an inquiry is supposed to do. Instead of narrowing the possibilities and moving toward an explanation, it had multiplied the questions and introduced a layer of institutional doubt that made the whole case feel darker and more sinister than the physical evidence actually warranted. There is also something worth noting about what the inquiry did not do. It did not conduct a serious search for the missing crew. There was no organised effort to look for survivors, no ships dispatched to search the area between the Azores and the point of discovery, no systematic attempt to find the lifeboat or any trace of the 10 people who had been aboard the Mary Celeste. The inquiry was focused on the ship, on the cargo, on the question of whether a crime had been committed. The people were, in a sense, secondary. They were the victims in Flood's theory, but they were not the subject of any serious rescue effort. By the time the inquiry was concluded, they had simply been absent long enough that the question of finding them alive had quietly been set aside. Benjamin Briggs's family in Massachusetts received the news gradually, through letters and newspaper reports. His mother, Sophia Briggs, never accepted that her son was dead, at least not for some time. His brother Oliver Briggs wrote to the American consul in Gibraltar asking for information, and received answers that were careful and incomplete. The family was told that the ship had been found abandoned, that the crew was missing, that an investigation was underway. They were not told much more than that for quite a long time, and the investigation, when it concluded, gave them nothing to hold on to. No bodies, no explanation, no closure of any kind. The Gibraltar inquiry ended without a verdict and without a theory that could be called proven. Solly Flood had arrived certain of foul play, and departed still certain of foul play, but with nothing solid enough to act on. The De Gratia crew were released, paid their reduced salvage, and went back to sea. The Mary Celeste was handed back to her owners and returned to service, and the question of what had happened to the 10 people on board remained exactly where it had been on December 4th, 1872, when Oliver Deveau had stepped onto her empty deck and found nothing but silence. What the inquiry had established, despite itself, was a detailed record of what the ship had looked like when she was found. Devoe's testimony, the surveyor's reports, the photographs that were taken at Gibraltar. These created a documentary record that researchers would return to for the next 150 years. The inquiry had failed as an investigation, but it had succeeded accidentally as an archive. And it is that archive, the specific details of what was found and what was not found, that any serious attempt to explain the Mary Celeste has to work from. The physical clues themselves, examined carefully and without Flood's predetermined conclusions, tell a story that is quieter and more specific than the one he was trying to tell. Each detail points in a particular direction, and when you lay them out together, the missing lifeboat, the trailing rope, the sounding rod, the empty barrels, the missing navigational instruments, the undamaged cargo, a picture begins to emerge. Not a picture of murder or conspiracy, but something else, something that has more to do with the cargo sitting in that hold than with any human conflict on deck, and that is where the evidence and the story leads next. So let us slow down for a moment and look at the ship herself, not through the lens of Flood's suspicions, and not through the romantic fog that would later settle over the story thanks to fiction. Just the physical evidence. What was actually there? What was actually missing? And what each of those things might reasonably mean. The most important single fact about the Mary Celeste when she was found is that her lifeboat was gone. This was not a small detail. The yawl, a small wooden boat that would have been stored on deck, had been removed. And the key word there is removed, not lost and not swept away. There were no signs that a wave had taken it. The davits, the small crane-like fixtures used to lower and raise a ship's boat, showed signs consistent with the boat having been launched deliberately. This tells us something significant about the nature of the departure. Whatever happened on that ship, the people who left did not simply fall overboard or vanish in the night. They had time to get into the lifeboat. They made a decision, or at least acted with enough coordination to launch the boat and get into it. This was not a sudden catastrophic event that took everyone by surprise in the dark. It was, at minimum, an organised enough departure that 10 people managed to get off the ship in the small boat. That detail matters enormously, because it rules out a whole category of explanations. It rules out a sudden structural failure that sank the crew along with part of the ship. It rules out an explosion so violent that everyone was killed instantly. It rules out a freak wave that swept the deck clean. Whatever happened, there was a period of time in which the crew and the Briggs family were alive, aware, and capable of making decisions. They chose to leave. The question is what made them choose that, and why they did not or could not come back. Alongside the missing lifeboat there was a rope. A long rope was found trailing from the stern of the Mary Celeste, hanging into the water behind the ship, frayed at the far end. This is one of the most quietly suggestive details in the entire case. The most natural explanation for that rope is that it was used as a tether. When the lifeboat was launched, the crew may have attached it to the ship by this rope, intending to keep the boat close while they waited for whatever danger they feared to pass. The frayed end suggests the rope parted under tension, either because the ship moved faster than expected, or because the sea conditions put too much strain on it, or simply because the rope was not strong enough for what was being asked of it. If that is what happened, then the crew did not abandon the ship intending to leave permanently. They left intending to return. They were waiting, at a safe distance, for something aboard the Mary Celeste to resolve itself, and then the rope broke and the ship sailed away from them, and they were left in a small open boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in late November. That is a deeply sobering thing to sit with for a moment. The possibility that the disappearance of the Mary Celeste was not a mystery at all in the sense of a permanent vanishing, but a tragedy of a very specific and terrible kind. A crew that left their ship for reasons they considered good enough, intending to return, and then lost the ship to the wind and the current before they could get back to it. If that is what happened, then they did not vanish. They were simply left behind, adrift in the lifeboat, with no ship to return to and no land within reach. Now, the binnacle. The binnacle is the housing that holds the ship's compass, typically a fixed wooden structure near the helm. When the Mary Celeste was found, the binnacle had been displaced from its normal position. It had been moved, or knocked, or shifted, and the compass inside it was damaged. This is an interesting detail because the binnacle is not something that moves easily or accidentally. It is a fixed piece of ship furniture. For it to have been displaced, something significant had to happen near the helm. One possibility is that it was knocked during a rushed or panicked departure, someone moving quickly past it in a moment of urgency. Another possibility is that it was displaced by some kind of sudden shock to the ship, a violent movement or vibration that shifted things on deck. Either way, it suggests that whatever happened was not entirely calm. The chronometer and sextant were missing. These are the two primary instruments a ship's captain used for navigation in 1872. The chronometer was an extremely precise clock used to calculate longitude, and the sextant was used to measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon, which gave latitude. Together, they were the essential tools for knowing where you were on the ocean. The fact that they were taken is significant. It means that whoever left the ship took the most important navigational tools with them. This is consistent with a deliberate departure rather than a sudden catastrophe. If you are leaving a ship because you think it is about to explode or sink, and you have a few moments to grab something, you grab the instruments that will help you find land. You grab the things that might save your life. The missing chronometer and sextant tell us that at least one person on that lifeboat was thinking clearly enough to take the tools they would need to navigate. The ship's papers were also missing, along with the captain's register. These were official documents, the ship's identity and legal record. Again, this points toward a deliberate and at least partially organised departure. You do not grab your ship's papers in a blind panic. You grab them because you are a careful person who knows they will be needed later. Captain Briggs was, by all accounts, exactly that kind of person. Then there is the cargo, 1,601 barrels of crude ethyl alcohol stowed in the hold. When the Mary Celeste arrived in Genoa, 9 of those barrels were found to be empty. Not leaking, not damaged, simply empty. And those 9 barrels had something in common. They were made of red oak rather than white oak. This is a detail that sounds like a footnote but is actually quite important. Red oak is a more porous wood than white oak. It is not as good at containing liquids, especially volatile ones. The difference between the two types of wood in terms of porosity is real and measurable. A barrel made of red oak staves is more likely to allow liquid to seep out slowly over time, and in the case of alcohol to allow vapour to escape into the surrounding space. 9 barrels worth of alcohol vapour, building up in a sealed hold over the course of a long voyage, is not a trivial amount. It is the kind of amount that, under the right conditions, could do something dramatic. The water in the hold is worth addressing carefully, because it is sometimes cited as evidence of serious flooding. When the Day Greater crew boarded the Mary Celeste, they found approximately 3.5 feet of water between the decks. That sounds alarming. But context matters here. The Mary Celeste had been sailing unmanned for at least 9 days, possibly longer. She had been moving through the Atlantic with sails partially set and no one at the helm to manage her trim or respond to weather. Ships take on water. They always have. The question is not whether there was water in the hold, but whether the amount was dangerous. And 3.5 feet, for a ship that had been sailing without a crew for over a week, was within the range that experienced sailors would have considered manageable. Devoe himself, in his testimony at Gibraltar, said the ship was in good condition and seaworthy. He sailed her to Gibraltar, a journey of several days without serious difficulty. If the water in the hold had been genuinely dangerous, he could not have done that. The sounding rod was found lying on deck, not stored in its proper place. The sounding rod was used to measure the depth of water in the hold. You lowered it down through a hatch, let it touch the bottom of the hold, and read the measurement on the rod when you pulled it back up. Finding it on deck, out of its storage position, suggests that someone had recently used it. Someone had been checking the water level in the hold. This is consistent with a crew that was worried about flooding, or at least monitoring it. It suggests that in the period before the abandonment, someone was paying close attention to how much water was below. The galley is worth a brief mention, though the accounts here are somewhat contradictory. Some reports from the time described food in the galley as if it had been recently prepared, while others described it as simply stored provisions in their normal state. The famous image of a half-eaten breakfast on the table, which became one of the most repeated details in popular accounts of the Mary Celeste, does not appear in Devoe's testimony or in the official survey reports. It appears to have been invented, or at least dramatically embellished in the fictional accounts that came later. What the actual evidence suggests is a galley that had been in normal use during the voyage and had not been destroyed or ransacked, but there is no credible documentation of a freshly cooked meal sitting on the table waiting for people who never came back. That image is a good story. It is just not a documented one. What the physical evidence taken together describes is something like this. A crew that had been monitoring the condition of their ship carefully, that had recently been checking the water level in the hold, that had the sounding rod out on deck. A crew that then encountered something alarming enough that they decided to leave the ship, but organised enough that they launched the lifeboat deliberately, took the navigational instruments and the ship's papers, and attached the boat to the ship by a rope. A departure that was not a blind panic but a precautionary withdrawal, with the intention of returning once the danger had passed. And then the rope broke, and the ship moved away, and whatever happened next happened out on the open water in a small boat, with no record and no witnesses. Every physical clue points in this direction. The missing lifeboat suggests a deliberate departure. The trailing rope suggests an intention to stay close to the ship. The missing navigational instrument suggests someone was thinking about finding land. The sounding rod on deck suggests recent concern about flooding or some disturbance in the hold. The displaced binnacle suggests something sudden and forceful happened near the helm. And the 9 empty red oak barrels suggest that something had been happening in the hold for some time before the crew left. None of these clues, individually, is definitive. You can look at each one and construct an alternative explanation. But when you look at all of them together, they form a consistent picture. Not of a murder, not of a conspiracy, not of a supernatural disappearance. A picture of a crew that was frightened by something connected to that cargo, that made a reasonable decision to leave the ship temporarily, and that was then separated from it by the simple and terrible mechanics of wind and rope and open water. What that frightening thing was, the specific event that sent 10 people into a small boat on the North Atlantic in late November, is the question that the physical evidence points toward but cannot fully answer on its own. The clues suggest a direction. They suggest something sudden, something connected to the hold, something that produced enough alarm to override the very strong human instinct to stay on a ship rather than trust a small wooden boat to the open sea. That instinct is powerful. Sailors know it. The ocean in November is cold and vast and unforgiving. You do not leave a functioning ship for a small boat unless you believe, genuinely believe, that the ship itself is the more dangerous place to be. What could make a ship feel more dangerous than the ocean? What could drive a careful, experienced, sober captain, a man who had invested his own money in the vessel, who had brought his wife and his 2-year-old daughter aboard, to conclude that the lifeboat was the safer option? The physical evidence has pointed us toward the hold, toward those 9 red oak barrels, toward the alcohol vapour that had been building in that confined space over the course of a long voyage. The next step is to look at what that vapour was actually capable of doing. and what one careful scientific experiment, more than a century after the voyage, revealed about how a ship full of industrial alcohol might behave on a cold Atlantic crossing. Because the answer, when you look at it closely, is both more dramatic and more mundane than the legend has ever suggested. The cargo of the Mary Celeste was not wine. It was not food, not textiles, not timber, not any of the ordinary goods that crossed the Atlantic in the holds of working merchant ships in 1872. It was 1,701 barrels of crude ethyl alcohol, industrial grade, produced for commercial use, owned by a New York firm called Meissner Ackermann and Company, and destined for Genoa, where it would be used in the production of fortified wines. The distinction matters. This was not drinkable alcohol in any practical sense. It was raw, unrefined, heavily contaminated with chemical byproducts that made it toxic to consume. Benjamin Briggs, who did not allow drinking on his ships under any circumstances, would have had no particular reason to worry about his crew sampling it. The cargo was not a temptation. It was a chemical load, and like many chemical loads, it came with properties that the people transporting it may not have fully understood. Ethyl alcohol evaporates readily. It does not need to be warmed to do so. At room temperature, and certainly at the temperatures inside a ship's hold during an Atlantic crossing in late autumn, alcohol will produce vapour continuously if it is exposed to air. The question is how much vapour, and what happens when that vapour builds up in a confined space with no easy way to escape. 9 of the 1,701 barrels were found empty when the Mary Celeste arrived in Genoa under the Dei Gratia crew. 9 barrels out of more than 1,700 is not a large proportion, but in absolute terms it represents a meaningful volume of liquid that had gone somewhere. The barrels themselves provide a possible explanation. They were made of red oak rather than white oak. This is a specific and documented detail from the Gibraltar Inquiry, and it is more significant than it might sound. White oak is the traditional wood for barrels carrying liquids because its grain structure is relatively tight. Red oak has a more open, porous grain. This is not ideal for holding liquids under pressure or over time. 9 red oak barrels in a warm hold over the course of a voyage from New York toward the Mediterranean could reasonably have leaked or allowed evaporation at a rate that emptied them entirely. And that evaporated alcohol had to go somewhere. In a closed or poorly ventilated space, alcohol vapour accumulates. It does not dissipate the way it would in open air. It settles and spreads, filling the lower parts of an enclosed area first because alcohol vapour is denser than air. In a ship's hold, with the hatches closed and minimal airflow, vapour from 9 leaking barrels could build to a significant concentration over a period of days or even weeks, and at a certain concentration, alcohol vapour becomes highly flammable. More than that, it becomes capable of something that feels almost counterintuitive when you first hear it. It can explode without fire. The technical term is a vapour explosion, sometimes called a deflagration. When a flammable vapour reaches the right concentration in a confined space and encounters an ignition source, the result is not necessarily a sustained fire. It can be a sudden, violent expansion of pressure, a bang, a flash, a concussive force that moves outward from the ignition point and then dissipates. In some circumstances, this kind of explosion produces very little heat and almost no lasting flame. The pressure wave does the work and then it is over in a fraction of a second. No sustained burning, no charring. No fire damage to the surrounding structure, just a sudden, enormous, terrifying noise and a shock wave moving through a wooden hull. This is the theory that has gained the most traction among researchers who have studied the Mary Celeste seriously. The idea is not new. It was proposed in various forms for many years, but it received its most rigorous examination in 2006, when a chemist named Andrea Sella at University College London decided to test it properly. Sella built a scale model of a ship's hold using wooden cubes arranged to create an enclosed space. He introduced alcohol vapour into the space at concentrations consistent with what 9 leaking barrels might have produced in the Mary Celeste's hold over the course of the voyage. He then introduced an ignition source. The result was dramatic. There was a sharp, visible flash of flame, a loud report, and a significant pressure wave that moved through the enclosed space, and then it was over. When Seller and his colleagues examined the wooden cubes afterward, they found no fire damage, no scorching, no charring, no burning. The wood was completely unaffected. The explosion had been real and forceful, but it had produced no sustained heat. It had left no mark. This finding is important because one of the persistent objections to any explosion theory for the Mary Celeste had always been the absence of fire damage. When the Dei Gratia crew boarded the ship, they found no evidence of burning, no scorched wood, no smoke damage, no fire-blackened surfaces. If something had exploded in the hold, surely it would have burned. Seller's experiment demonstrated that this assumption was wrong. A vapour explosion of this kind can be violent enough to terrify everyone on board, while leaving the ship structurally undamaged and visually unscathed. You could walk onto that ship afterward and see nothing. The hold would look normal, the barrels would be sitting in their places. No. The wood would be clean. But if you had been standing on deck when it happened, you would have felt the ship shudder. You would have heard a sound like a cannon fired from inside the hull. You would have seen, perhaps, a flash of light from the hatch covers or the ventilation gaps. And you would have had absolutely no way of knowing whether it was going to happen again, or whether the next one would be larger, or whether the next one would catch and burn. This is the scenario that the alcohol vapour theory proposes, not a catastrophic explosion that destroyed the ship or killed the crew. A sudden, violent, non-destructive pressure event in the hold, alarming enough to convince Captain Briggs that the ship was in immediate danger of a much larger explosion or fire. Alarming enough to make him decide quickly that everyone needed to get off. Think about what Briggs knew at that moment, or what he thought he knew. He had a hold full of industrial alcohol. He had heard or felt something explosive come from that hold. He had no way to inspect the damage, no way to know if fire had started somewhere inside, no way to know if another explosion was seconds away. He was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He had his wife and his 2-year-old daughter on board. He had a crew of experienced sailors who were presumably as frightened as he was. The rational decision, in that moment, was to get everyone off the ship and onto the lifeboat, attached by a long rope to the stern, and wait at a safe distance until they could be sure the danger had passed. This is not a panicked, irrational response. It is actually a reasonable maritime decision given the information available. You do not stay on a ship that you believe is about to explode or burn. You get your people off, you maintain contact with the vessel through the rope, and you wait. If nothing further happens, you go back aboard. If it burns or sinks, you are alive to be rescued. The problem, of course, is what happened to the rope. The long line found trailing from the stern of the Mary Celeste, frayed at the end, is one of the most telling physical details of the entire mystery. A frayed rope end suggests that the line did not come loose cleanly. It was not untied, not cut. It broke under tension. The lifeboat was attached to the ship, and at some point the rope parted. This could have happened in any number of ways. A wave, a sudden gust of wind that pushed the ship forward faster than the small boat could follow, a weak spot in the line that had not been noticed in the rush to launch. Any of these things could cause a rope to snap. And once the rope snapped, the ship was gone. The Mary Celeste, under partial sail, would have moved away from the lifeboat at a speed that a small, heavily loaded boat full of people could not match. Within minutes, the gap would have been too large to close by rowing. Within an hour, the ship would have been out of sight. And that is where the trail ends. The lifeboat was never found. The 10 people who were on it were never found. There is no record of them arriving anywhere, no account of a rescue, no body recovered from the sea. The North Atlantic in late November is not a forgiving place for a small open boat. The water temperature would have been cold enough to cause serious problems within hours if anyone went overboard. The weather in that region in late autumn is unpredictable and often severe. A small wooden boat with 10 people, no shelter and limited provisions, drifting in the open ocean after losing contact with its ship would have had a very short survival window. The alcohol vapour theory does not answer every question. It does not explain, for instance, why the ship's log contains no entry describing unusual smells or sounds from the hold in the days before the abandonment. It does not explain why the binnacle was displaced and damaged, though some researchers suggest this could have been caused by the pressure wave from the explosion moving through the ship's structure. It does not explain the specific timing of the event with certainty, since the last log entry was November 25th and the ship was found on December 4th, leaving 9 days unaccounted for. If the explosion happened on November 25th, that would explain the sudden end of the log entries, but this is inference, not documentation. There is also the question of why 9 barrels specifically, and why those 9 were made of red oak when the rest were white oak. This is a detail that has never been fully explained. One possibility is that the red oak barrels were a last-minute substitution when white oak was not available, a not uncommon practice in commercial shipping of the era. Another is that they were older barrels, already compromised, that happened to be included in the load. The records do not tell us. What they do tell us is that 9 barrels were empty on arrival, and that those 9 were the ones made of the more porous wood. The theory also does not explain why there was no sustained ignition. If alcohol vapour exploded in the hold, what ignited it? A spark from the ship's structure, from shifting metal fittings, from a lantern, from static electricity generated by the movement of the ship through the water. Any of these could theoretically serve as an ignition source. But there is no documented evidence of what the source was. The experiment demonstrates that such an explosion is physically possible and consistent with the evidence. It does not reconstruct the actual event. What the alcohol vapour theory does better than any other explanation is account for the specific combination of facts that makes the Mary Celeste so puzzling. It explains why the crew left in an organised manner rather than in blind panic. It explains why the cargo was intact. It explains why there was no fire damage. It explains why a careful, experienced, sober captain would choose to abandon a seaworthy ship. It explains the timing, roughly consistent with the last log entry, and it is grounded in real chemistry and confirmed by real experiment, not speculation or legend. It is still a theory. The word is worth holding on to. Andrea Seller's experiment demonstrated that this kind of explosion is possible, and that it leaves the kind of evidence profile consistent with what was found on the Mary Celeste. It did not prove that this is what happened. Proof, in the strict sense, is not available. The hold of the Mary Celeste in November 1872 cannot be reconstructed. The people who were there cannot be asked. The physical evidence that survives is fragmentary, filtered through Victorian-era documentation, and complicated by over a century of myth and embellishment. But when you sit with all the evidence carefully, when you set aside the fictional additions and the dramatic embellishments and the conspiracy theories and look only at what is actually documented, the alcohol vapour explanation fits more cleanly than anything else. It requires no murder, no fraud, no supernatural event, no piracy, no mutiny. It requires only a leaky barrel, a spark, a frightened crew, a rope, and the Atlantic wind. The tragedy of the Mary Celeste is not that the answer is unknowable. It may actually be that the answer is fairly ordinary, in the sense that it involves a mundane industrial accident and a piece of bad luck with a rope. 10 people died, in all probability, not because of anything dramatic or sinister, but because a line broke at the wrong moment and a ship sailed away without them. The ocean did the rest. But there are other explanations that deserve a fair hearing. The alcohol vapour theory is the most scientifically supported, but it is not the only serious proposal. The sea in that region, the behaviour of the ship, the condition of the crew, all of these have generated their own alternative readings of what might have happened in those 9 missing days, and some of those alternatives touch on forces that are less predictable and in some ways more unsettling than a leaking barrel. So let us set the alcohol vapour theory aside for a moment. Not dismiss it, but rest it gently on the table while we look at some of the other proposals that have been put forward over the years, because the truth is that serious researchers, sailors, and maritime historians have not agreed on a single explanation, and some of the alternative theories are worth examining carefully, not because they are more convincing, but because they illuminate different aspects of what the Mary Celeste was doing in those final days before her crew vanished. One of the older natural explanations involves a waterspout. A waterspout is essentially a marine tornado, a rotating column of air and water that forms over the ocean and can reach considerable height and force. They are not uncommon in the Atlantic, particularly in warmer months, and while November is late in the season for them, they are not impossible. The idea is that a waterspout struck the Mary Celeste with enough violence to terrify the crew into believing the ship was in immediate danger, causing them to abandon it. Some accounts of waterspouts describe them as appearing suddenly, with little warning, and producing a roaring sound that can be deeply alarming even to experienced sailors. The difficulty with this theory is that waterspouts, while frightening, rarely cause ships to be abandoned. Sailors who have encountered them generally describe taking evasive action, altering course, or simply riding out the disturbance rather than leaving the vessel entirely. A waterspout that was powerful enough to make a seasoned captain like Briggs order an evacuation would likely have left significant physical damage on the ship, torn rigging, broken spars, shattered deck fittings. The Mary Celeste showed none of this. Her sails were partially set and some were damaged, but not in the way you would expect from a violent rotational wind event. The rigging was in reasonable condition for a ship that had been sailing unmanned. The decks were intact. There were no signs of the kind of structural punishment a serious waterspout would have delivered. There is also the question of timing. A waterspout passes quickly. It does not linger for hours. If the crew abandoned ship in response to a waterspout, they would have found themselves in a lifeboat watching the waterspout move away, and the Mary Celeste sitting largely undamaged in the water. The rational response would have been to reboard the ship as soon as the danger passed. The fact that they apparently did not suggest either that something else prevented them from returning, or that the initial cause of the abandonment was something they could not watch pass and then dismiss. The seaquake theory is more interesting, and in some ways more plausible. The Azores are a volcanic archipelago sitting on the mid-Atlantic ridge, one of the most seismically active underwater zones on the planet. Underwater earthquakes in this region are not unusual. A seaquake, which is an earthquake occurring directly beneath a ship at sea, produces a very specific and deeply unsettling experience. The ship does not rock gently as it would in heavy waves. It shudders, jolts, and vibrates in a way that feels nothing like normal sea motion. Sailors who have experienced seaquakes often describe the sensation as the ship striking a solid object, or as a sudden violent shudder running through the entire hull. The noise can be alarming, a deep grinding or crashing sound transmitted through the wooden structure of the ship from the water itself. The argument for a seaquake goes roughly like this. The Mary Celeste was sailing near the Azores on November 25th, as confirmed by the last log entry. If a seaquake occurred in that area on or around that date, it could have caused the ship to shudder violently, possibly dislodging the binnacle and displacing the compass, which would account for the binnacle damage found by the Dei Gratia crew. The crew, feeling the ship shudder and hearing alarming sounds from below, might have feared that the hull was cracking or that the ship was breaking apart. In that state of fear, they might have sounded the hold with the sounding rod, found what appeared to be rising water, and concluded that the ship was sinking. The sounding rod left lying on deck rather than stored away is consistent with someone having used it in a hurry and not put it back. This is actually one of the more coherent alternative explanations, because it accounts for several details at once. It explains the binnacle damage. It explains why the sounding rod was on deck. It explains why a careful captain might have ordered an evacuation, even though the ship was not actually sinking. A seaquake does not damage a ship the way a reef collision does. The hull might have remained perfectly intact even as the crew believed it was compromised. If the ship shuddered violently and then appeared to take on water, and the crew could not determine from a quick inspection whether the hull was breached, the decision to leave might have felt like the only safe option. The problem, as with most of these theories, is the absence of any record. There is no documented seaquake in that area on or around November 25th, 1872. That does not mean one did not occur. Seismic monitoring in the 19th century was rudimentary at best, and a moderate underwater earthquake in the mid-Atlantic would not necessarily have been recorded anywhere. The Azores region experiences seismic activity regularly enough that a moderate event might not even have been noteworthy to people on land. But the lack of corroborating evidence means the seaquake theory remains speculative, an appealing fit for some of the physical clues but not provable. What is worth noting is that the seaquake theory and the alcohol vapor theory are not necessarily mutually exclusive. A seaquake strong enough to shake the ship could also have been strong enough to shift the barrels in the hold, breaking the seal on already compromised red oak staves and releasing vapor more rapidly. A sudden shudder could have caused a lantern or a metal fitting to strike something in a way that produced a spark. The two events could have happened in close sequence, a seaquake causing the initial shock and the vapor explosion following minutes later, compounding the crew's terror and making the decision to abandon ship feel overwhelmingly urgent. This is speculation layered on speculation, of course, but it is the kind of speculation that at least follows from the physical evidence rather than contradicting it. There is also a structural failure theory that deserves a brief mention. The Mary Celeste had a history of minor mechanical problems, as we have already seen. She was not a new ship in 1872. She was 11 years old, had changed hands multiple times, and had been through enough that her reputation was at best mixed. The theory here is that some sudden structural problem, a pump failure, a rapid and unexpected ingress of water through a compromised seam, a problem with the cargo hold that made the crew believe the ship was in immediate danger of foundering, could have triggered the evacuation. The water in the hold is relevant here. When the Dei Gratia crew boarded the Mary Celeste, they found approximately 3.5 feet of water between the decks. This sounds alarming, but maritime historians have consistently pointed out that for a ship that had been sailing unmanned for somewhere between 9 and 11 days, with sails partially set and no one at the pumps, this amount of water is not unusual. Ships of that era took on water constantly. Pumping was a routine part of daily operation. A ship left without pumping for over a week would naturally accumulate water in the hold, particularly in rough Atlantic weather. The water level, in other words, does not indicate a sinking ship. It indicates an unmanned ship. But here is the interesting wrinkle. When the crew was still aboard, they would not have known that the water level was normal for an unmanned vessel. If they checked the hold and found 3 feet of water, or even 2 feet, rising faster than expected, and if they were already frightened by some other event, that reading on the sounding rod might have confirmed their worst fear. The sounding rod was found on deck, not put away. That small detail has nagged at researchers for a long time. It suggests someone used it in a hurry, read the result, and did not stop to replace it before doing something more urgent. The binnacle damage is another physical detail that different theories interpret differently. The binnacle is the housing for the ship's compass, typically a sturdy wooden or brass structure mounted on deck near the helm. The Mary Celeste's binnacle was found displaced, and the compass inside it was damaged. Some researchers have pointed to this as evidence of a sudden violent event, something that moved or struck the binnacle with enough force to shift it from its mounting. A seaquake could do this. A pressure wave from an explosion in the hold could do this. A violent wave or a collision with something in the water could do this. The damage is real, but its cause is open to interpretation. The missing navigational instruments are also worth considering in this context. The ship's chronometer and sextant were gone. These were the primary tools for determining a ship's position at sea. If you were abandoning a ship and you had a few seconds to grab something, a chronometer and a sextant would be sensible choices. They would help you navigate the lifeboat. They would help you find land. Taking them suggests the abandonment was not completely disorganized, that someone had the presence of mind to grab the tools most useful for survival. This is actually consistent with the alcohol vapor theory as well, where the crew was frightened but not in blind panic, organised enough to attach a rope to the stern and take their navigation instruments before getting into the lifeboat. None of the natural theories, the water spout, the seaquake, the structural failure, fully answer the question that sits at the centre of everything. Why did no one come back? Why did the crew, having left the ship in a lifeboat, apparently never return to it and never reach land? The Mary Celeste was not sinking. She sailed on for 9 days and was found in reasonable condition. If the crew left her for a reason that turned out to be false, and if the lifeboat stayed near the ship for any length of time, why did they not reboard? The rope is the most haunting detail in this regard. A long rope was found trailing from the stern of the Mary Celeste when the Dei Gracia crew boarded her. The rope was frayed at the end. The fraying suggests it had broken under tension rather than been cut. The most natural reading of this detail is that the rope was attached to the lifeboat as a tether, intended to keep the small boat close to the ship while the crew waited to see whether the danger passed. If the rope broke, the lifeboat would have drifted free. In the wind and current of the open Atlantic, a small boat without a sail or with limited rowing capacity would have been carried away from the ship very quickly. Within an hour, the distance might have been too great to close by rowing, particularly if the sea was rough. This is the detail that makes the water spout and seaquake theories difficult to fully accept on their own. A water spout passes. A seaquake is over in seconds or minutes. If the crew was tethered to the ship and waiting, they would have had every opportunity to reboard once the immediate danger passed. The rope breaking changes everything. It transforms a temporary evacuation into a permanent separation, not because anyone chose it, but because a frayed line gave way at the worst possible moment. It is possible, and this is where the seaquake and vapor theories might work together, that the crew was not simply waiting passively. If they had seen or heard an explosion, if the ship had lurched violently and then appeared to be settling lower in the water, they might have been actively rowing away from it, trying to put distance between themselves and what they feared was an imminent sinking or a second explosion. In that case, the rope would have been under considerable tension. A frayed or weakened line under tension in rough water would not last long. The cold is worth remembering here too. The North Atlantic in late November sits at temperatures that can cause serious physical impairment within a relatively short time if anyone went into the water. Even without going overboard, a small open boat in late autumn Atlantic weather would have been brutally cold. 10 people in a small wooden boat, frightened, possibly wet, without shelter, in deteriorating weather, would have been in a genuinely desperate situation within hours of losing sight of the Mary Celeste. The ocean in that region does not offer second chances easily. What all of these theories share, the vapor explosion, the water spout, the seaquake, the structural scare, is a common ending. 10 people in a small lifeboat separated from their ship somewhere in the North Atlantic in late November 1872, with no one to find them and no way to signal for help. Whatever put them in that boat, the ocean finished the story. The specific mechanism of the abandonment may be debatable. The likely fate of the people in that lifeboat is not. And yet, even accepting all of this, there are still those who are not satisfied with natural explanations. There are those who look at the Mary Celeste and see not an accident, not a panic, not a frayed rope, but something deliberate, something human, something darker. Because for every theory that points to the sea and the weather and the cargo, there has always been another theory pointing at the people themselves, at the possibility that what happened on that ship was not an accident at all, but a crime. The human theories surrounding the Mary Celeste have never quite gone away. They have been revisited, debated, dismissed, and quietly revived again across the 150 years since the ship was found sailing empty in the Atlantic. And it is not hard to understand why. Natural disasters leave no one to blame. A frayed rope and a cold sea are sad, but they are not satisfying. There is something in the way the human mind works that keeps looking for intention behind unexplained events, keeps searching for a person, a motive, a decision that set everything in motion. And so the darker theories have always run alongside the natural ones, sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, but never entirely silent. The first person to publicly suspect foul play was Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar who led the initial inquiry in December 1872. Flood was not a man who warmed to simple explanations. He was methodical, suspicious by professional habit, and from the moment the Mary Celeste arrived in Gibraltar under the custody of the Dei Gratia crew, he found the whole situation deeply uncomfortable. 2 ships leave New York within a week of each other. The captains know each other. One ship is found abandoned by the other. The salvage claim would be worth a significant sum. Flood looked at this and saw a pattern he did not like. His suspicion fell primarily on the crew of the Dei Gratia. His theory, loosely constructed but firmly held, was that the Dei Gratia crew had somehow boarded the Mary Celeste, while both ships were still at sea, killed or otherwise disposed of the brig's family and crew, and then staged the discovery to claim salvage rights. It was a dramatic theory, and Flood pursued it with genuine energy. He had the Mary Celeste examined closely for signs of violence. He noted the sword found below deck, the reddish stains on the deck planking, the marks on the bow that he believed showed signs of deliberate damage. He held the Dei Gratia crew in Gibraltar for months, delaying their salvage payment and treating them as suspects rather than rescuers. The problem was that the evidence simply did not support him. The sword stains were tested and found not to be blood. The reddish stains on the deck were similarly inconclusive. The marks on the bow, which Flood believed showed axe cuts or deliberate damage, were later examined by a more dispassionate eye and found consistent with normal wear or minor collision damage. No bodies were ever found. No motive was ever established. Captain David Morehouse and Captain Benjamin Briggs were by all accounts friendly acquaintances rather than enemies. There was no suggestion of any financial dispute, personal grievance or professional rivalry between them. And the timeline was awkward too. The Dei Gratia left New York a week after the Mary Celeste. For Morehouse's crew to have staged a murder and a discovery, they would have needed to catch up with the Mary Celeste somewhere in the Atlantic, commit violence against 10 people without leaving any convincing evidence, and then sail on and pretend to find the ship by chance. It was possible in the loosest theoretical sense, but it required a great deal of coincidence and a great deal of luck for the perpetrators, and it left no explanation for what happened to the bodies. The inquiry eventually ended without charging anyone, and the Dei Gratia crew received their salvage award, though it was considerably reduced from what they might have expected, a consequence of Flood's lingering suspicion tainting the proceedings even after his specific accusations fell apart. Morehouse received roughly £1,700, which represented only a fraction of the total value of ship and cargo. The men who had sailed a ghost ship across the Atlantic, done the work of 2 crews, and brought a valuable vessel safely to port were rewarded in effect with official distrust. It was not a satisfying outcome for anyone. The mutiny theory has also had its advocates over the years, and it is worth taking seriously for a moment before examining why it too runs into difficulties. The basic argument is straightforward. Sailors on long voyages sometimes reach breaking points. Captains could be harsh, working conditions could be brutal, resentments could build over weeks at sea until something gave way. History offers examples of ship mutinies that ended in violence, in captains being thrown overboard, in crews taking control and sailing to places they preferred. Could the crew of the Mary Celeste have turned on Captain Briggs? The difficulty is that Briggs was not that kind of captain. Every account of him describes a man who was fair, experienced, and deeply religious. He did not drink, and he did not allow drinking on his ships, which is occasionally cited as a potential source of resentment among sailors accustomed to a daily rum ration. But abstaining from alcohol was not so unusual among certain captains of that era, and the crew Briggs had assembled for this voyage had no known history of trouble. The 5 sailors on board included 3 men named Lorenzen, likely related who had sailed together before. These were not desperate men pressed into service against their will. They were working sailors who had signed on for a legitimate voyage with a reputable captain. A mutiny would also need to explain what happened next. If the crew killed Briggs and his family, where did they go? They could not simply sail into a European port and pretend nothing had happened. A ship arriving in Genoa without its captain, and with a family known to be on board, would have raised immediate questions. They could have abandoned the ship themselves and tried to disappear, but 10 people disappearing without a trace in 1872 would have been difficult. Some of them would eventually have been found, recognised or identified. None of them ever were. The mutiny theory requires not just violence, but a perfect and permanent vanishing of everyone involved, which strains credulity considerably. The insurance fraud theory is perhaps the most intellectually interesting of the human explanations, if only because it attempts to give everyone a motive and a plan rather than simply assigning blame. The argument runs roughly like this. Briggs and the cargo owners, Meissner, Ackermann and Company, conspired to fake the abandonment of the ship. The plan would be to claim the ship lost, collect the insurance money, and then disappear. The Dei Gratia, captained by Briggs's acquaintance Morehouse, was in on the scheme, which is why it conveniently found the ship and brought it to Gibraltar. This theory has a certain narrative tidiness that makes it appealing at first glance. It explains the organised nature of the departure, the missing navigation instruments, the intact cargo. If you are staging an abandonment rather than experiencing a real one, you might take care to make it look deliberate without making it look criminal. You might take the chronometer and sextant because you needed them, not because you were panicking. But the details fall apart quickly. Briggs had invested his own money in the Mary Celeste. He owned a share of the ship. Collecting insurance on her would have required him to give up that investment, and the insurance value of the ship was not dramatically higher than what his share was worth. More importantly, the cargo was valued at approximately $35,000, which was a very substantial sum in 1872. Abandoning that cargo without any mechanism to recover it would have been an enormous financial loss for the owners, not a gain. The insurance on the cargo would not have exceeded its market value. Fraud schemes generally require the fraudsters to come out ahead. This one would not obviously have done that. There is also the matter of Sarah Briggs and their daughter Sophia. Benjamin Briggs brought his wife and 2-year-old child on this voyage. If he had known in advance that he was going to fake an abandonment and disappear into obscurity somewhere, why would he have brought his family? His older son Arthur had been left at home with his grandmother, which some have pointed to as suspicious, as if Briggs knew something would happen and wanted to protect the boy. But Arthur was 7 years old and in school. It was entirely normal for a child of that age to stay home rather than cross the Atlantic on a working cargo ship. Sophia at 2 was young enough to travel comfortably with her mother. The decision to bring her was not unusual for the time. The piracy theory is perhaps the simplest of the human explanations, and also the one most easily dismissed. Pirates, in the conventional sense, would have had an obvious motive. Take the cargo, take the ship, take anything of value. But nothing was taken. The cargo sat undisturbed in the hold. The personal belongings of the Briggs family remained in the cabin. Sarah Briggs's sewing machine was still there. Sophia's toys were still there. The crew's clothing and valuables were untouched. A pirate attack that leaves everything behind is not much of a pirate attack. One could imagine a more targeted piracy, perhaps kidnappers who wanted the people rather than the goods. But this would have required a very specific kind of criminal operation in the middle of the Atlantic, far from any coast, with no obvious ransom demand ever made and no survivors ever found. It is possible in the loosest sense, but it explains nothing and requires a great deal of invention. There is a smaller theory, sometimes raised in a half-amused way, that the crew secretly drank the alcohol cargo and that what followed was the result of mass intoxication. This one can be set aside fairly quickly. The cargo was crude industrial ethyl alcohol, denatured and not fit for human consumption. It was not the kind of alcohol that sailors might have been tempted to drink on a long voyage. Consuming it in any significant quantity would have caused serious illness or death, not a cheerful evening followed by a mysterious disappearance. Briggs's known attitude toward drinking also makes this scenario unlikely. He had specifically chosen a crew that would operate a sober ship. What is striking about all of these human theories, when you lay them out one after another, is how much each one requires you to ignore. Flood's suspicion of the De Gracia crew requires ignoring the absence of motive and the absence of bodies. The mutiny theory requires ignoring everything known about Briggs's character and his crew's history. The insurance fraud theory requires ignoring the financial logic and the presence of a young family. The piracy theory requires ignoring the untouched cargo and belongings. Each theory has a moment where it seems to fit, and then a detail where it simply does not. This is not to say that human explanations are impossible. History is full of crimes that were never solved, disappearances that were never explained, and stories where the truth turned out to be darker than anyone wanted to believe. The Mary Celeste could, in some version of events, have involved human violence or deliberate deception. The absence of proof is not the same as proof of absence, but the weight of the evidence, such as it is, does not lean in that direction. It leans towards something less dramatic and more tragic. Frightened people, a small boat, a frayed rope, an unforgiving ocean. Still, the human theories have never been fully abandoned, and perhaps that is appropriate. In a story this old, with evidence this fragmentary, certainty of any kind would be its own kind of dishonesty. What we can say is that every theory requiring deliberate human action runs into obstacles that the natural theories, imperfect as they are, do not quite face in the same way. The natural explanation asks us to accept a terrible accident. The human explanations ask us to accept a conspiracy that left no trace, no survivors, no confession, and no financial benefit to anyone who might have arranged it. And so, the case remains what it has always been. A collection of clues pointing in roughly the same direction, but never quite reaching a definitive conclusion. The human theories add a layer of darkness to the story, a reminder that the sea is not the only thing capable of swallowing people whole, but they also, in their failures, push us back toward the simpler and sadder explanation. 10 people in a lifeboat, somewhere in the North Atlantic in the cold of late November 1872, and a ship sailing on without them. The story of the Mary Celeste might have remained a curious maritime footnote, known to sailors and researchers and the occasional enthusiast of unexplained events, eventually fading into the kind of obscurity that swallows most 19th century shipping incidents. What prevented that from happening, what transformed a genuine but ultimately limited mystery into a global legend that has endured for 150 years, was a short piece of fiction published in London in January 1884 by a young writer who had not yet become famous for anything at all. The young writer's name was Arthur Conan Doyle, and in January 1884 he was 24 years old, working as a doctor in South Sea, England, seeing patients during the day and writing fiction in whatever time remained. He had published a handful of short stories, none of them particularly noticed. Sherlock Holmes was still 3 years away. His name meant almost nothing to the reading public. But he had read about the Mary Celeste, as many people had in the years since the Gibraltar Inquiry, and something about the story caught his imagination. Not just the mystery itself, but the shape of it. The way it seemed to demand an explanation that no one had been able to provide. He saw in it the outline of something he could use. The story he wrote was called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement, and it was published in the Cornhill magazine in January 1884. He did not put his name on it. It appeared anonymously, written in the first person, in the voice of a survivor who claimed to have been aboard the ship and to know exactly what had happened. The narrator was a doctor, a passenger, who described in calm and convincing detail the events that led to the ship's abandonment. The writing was careful and grounded and full of the kind of specific detail that makes fiction feel like testimony. Readers had no particular reason to doubt it. The Cornhill magazine was a respectable publication, not a sensationalist penny paper. First-person accounts of dramatic events were a common journalistic format of the time. Many readers took it as a true account. Doyle made several changes to the story that would echo for over a century. The most durable of these was the name. He called the ship the Mary Celeste, not the Mary Celeste. A small difference, just a French inflection where there had been an English one, but it stuck. For decades afterward, journalists, writers, and even some researchers reproduced the name as Mary Celeste, apparently unaware that they were repeating a spelling introduced by a fiction writer who had never been aboard the ship and was not particularly concerned with accuracy. Even today, if you search for the story, you will find both names used interchangeably, and the confusion traces directly back to that single January issue of a Victorian literary magazine. But the name was the least of it. What Doyle invented, and what truly entered the public imagination, were the details of what the crew supposedly left behind. In his fictional version, the ship was found with a meal still on the table, half eaten, as if the passengers and crew had simply stood up mid-breakfast and walked away. There was hot food, there was a cup of tea still warm, there was the impression of a life interrupted at the very moment of living it, with no warning and no explanation. These details were vivid and unsettling in exactly the way a good story needs to be. They created the image of a ghost ship not just in the technical maritime sense of an abandoned vessel, but in the full atmospheric sense of a place where people had been present moments ago and were now simply gone. None of it was true. The actual boarding party found no freshly cooked meal, no warm tea, no half-eaten breakfast. Oliver Deveau, the first mate of the Dei Gratia who led the boarding and gave the most thorough testimony at Gibraltar, described finding food stored in the galley, not set out on a table. He described a ship that had been empty for days, not minutes. The impression was not of a life interrupted, but of a vessel that had been sailing alone for some time. The difference matters enormously. A ship abandoned days ago for whatever reason is a tragedy. A ship abandoned in the middle of breakfast for no apparent reason at all is something stranger and more disturbing, something that resists ordinary explanation almost by design. Doyle also invented a cat. In his story, a cat was found sleeping peacefully in the captain's cabin, undisturbed, as if whatever had happened to the humans had simply not applied to the cat. This is a wonderful detail in the way that fictional details can be wonderful. It adds texture and strangeness without explaining anything. A sleeping cat amid the mystery of a vanished crew is the kind of image that stays in the mind. There was no cat. No cat was mentioned in any of the boarding party's testimony, in any of the official records, or in any contemporary account of the ship's condition. The cat existed only in Doyle's imagination, and then, almost immediately, in the imagination of everyone who read his story. He also invented a logbook with terrifying final entries. In the fictional version, the last entries in the ship's log described increasingly strange and frightening events. A crew growing fearful, something happening that the narrator could not fully explain. This was the narrative mechanism Doyle needed to drive his story forward. A sense of mounting dread recorded in the very document that should have provided facts. The real log, as we know, contained nothing of the kind. The last entry was routine, a position notation, a record of the ship's location near the Azores. There was no fear, no warning, no dramatic final words, just a date, a position, and then silence. The reaction to the story was immediate and interesting. Many readers believed it. The Cornhill magazine received correspondence treating the account as genuine. People discussed it as if Jefferson were a real survivor, and the events described were documented fact. This was partly because of how well Doyle had written it, and partly because the public already knew about the Mary Celeste from the coverage of the Gibraltar inquiry a decade earlier. The story fit neatly into a space that had been left open by the failure of the official investigation to reach a conclusion. Here, finally, was an answer. The fact that the answer was invented did not initially matter, because no one knew it was invented. Solly Flood, the Attorney General of Gibraltar, who had led the original investigation and spent considerable energy trying to prove foul play, was furious. He wrote to the American consul and to the magazine demanding a correction. He was not wrong to be angry. The story was fiction presented in a form that invited readers to mistake it for fact, and it was putting invented details into a case that was still, in some sense, unresolved. The magazine eventually acknowledged that the story was fiction, but by then the damage, if that is the right word, was already done. The details had circulated: the half-eaten breakfast, the sleeping cat, the terrifying log entries. They had taken on a life of their own. What is interesting about Doyle's intervention in the story is that it reveals something about how mysteries work in the public imagination. The real Mary Celeste was genuinely puzzling, but it was puzzling in a way that was also somewhat ordinary. A ship found abandoned at sea, with evidence of a hurried departure, in a region known for unpredictable weather, carrying a volatile cargo. These are the ingredients of a maritime incident, not a supernatural event. The actual mystery is a human one, frightened people making a decision under pressure, and the tragedy is the kind of tragedy that the sea produces regularly. It is sad and unexplained, but it is not inexplicable in the way that truly strange events are inexplicable. Doyle made it inexplicable. By stripping away the mundane details and replacing them with images that defied ordinary explanation, he created a story that could not be resolved by any natural theory. A meal still warm on the table, a cat sleeping in the cabin, a log full of fear. These details do not fit a panicked abandonment after a cargo explosion. They do not fit a waterspout or a seaquake. They do not fit anything, because they were never meant to fit anything. They were meant to unsettle, and they did for a very long time. The template that Doyle established in that one short story became the template for every ghost ship story that followed. When people talk about ghost ships, they almost invariably describe them in the terms that Doyle invented. A ship found drifting, a meal on the table, personal belongings untouched, no sign of struggle, no explanation. This is the ghost ship as a cultural object, and it was largely built in 1884 by a young doctor in South Sea who was trying to sell a story to a magazine. The Mary Celeste existed before Doyle wrote about it, but the Mary Celeste as a legend, as a fixture of popular culture, as the archetypal ghost ship, that version was his creation. The confusion between the real ship and the fictional one persisted for a remarkably long time. Serious researchers working on the case in the early 20th century sometimes cited details from Doyle's story as if they were part of the original record. The half-eaten breakfast appeared in newspaper accounts, in encyclopedia entries, in books about maritime mysteries. The Mary Celeste spelling appeared everywhere. It took decades of careful archival work to separate what Doyle had invented from what the boarding party had actually found. Some of that work was done by researchers like Charles E.D. Fay, whose 1942 book on the Mary Celeste attempted to reconstruct the actual facts from primary sources and to identify which widely repeated details were fictional in origin. Even after that work was done, the fictional details proved remarkably resistant to correction. The half-eaten breakfast is still mentioned in popular accounts of the story. The name Mary Celeste is still used. The image of a ship found in the middle of a meal, crew gone, food still warm, is still the image that most people carry when they think of the Mary Celeste. This is not entirely Doyle's fault. The fictional version is simply a better story than the true one, in the narrow sense that it is more dramatic and more atmospheric and more resistant to ordinary explanation. It satisfies the imagination in a way that the real evidence does not. There is something almost fitting about the fact that the man who created Sherlock Holmes, the great fictional detective whose method was the precise and patient analysis of physical evidence, was also the man who introduced the most persistent and misleading fictional details into one of history's most famous unsolved cases. Holmes would have been appalled. He would have gone back to the primary sources, interviewed Devoe, read the Gibraltar testimony, examined the actual log entries, and dismissed the half-eaten breakfast in about 30 seconds. But Doyle in 1884 was not yet Holmes. He was a young writer who saw a good story and improved it, as writers do, without perhaps fully reckoning with the consequences of doing so in a form that readers might mistake for fact. What the Doyle episode tells us, stepping back from the ship itself for a moment, is that the Mary Celeste story is really two stories running alongside each other. One is the historical story of a real ship, real people, and a genuine unexplained event in November and December of 1872. The other is a cultural story about how a genuine mystery gets transformed, amplified, and eventually half buried under layers of invention. The two stories have been entangled for so long that separating them requires a kind of deliberate effort, a willingness to set aside the more compelling version in favour of the more accurate one. And the accurate version, stripped of Doyle's additions, is still genuinely mysterious. That is the thing worth remembering. The Mary Celeste does not need a warm breakfast or a sleeping cat to be interesting. It does not need terrifying log entries or a ship found in the middle of some interrupted moment of ordinary life. The real story, with its 9 empty barrels and its missing lifeboat and its frayed rope trailing in the Atlantic and its last log entry dated November 25th and its 10 people, who were never seen again, is more than sufficient. The real story is a tragedy, and tragedies do not need embellishment. But the fictional version has done something that the real version could not quite do on its own. It has kept the story alive. It has kept people asking questions and reading accounts and commissioning documentaries and running experiments with alcohol vapour in laboratory settings. The legend, however inaccurate, has functioned as a kind of preservation mechanism for the genuine mystery underneath it, which is perhaps the most generous way to look at what Doyle inadvertently set in motion. He buried the real story under invention, but he also made sure that the real story would never be forgotten. The logbook itself, the actual physical record that the crew of the Mary Celeste kept during their voyage, has something quiet and important to say about all of this. And it says it not through dramatic entries or terrifying final words, but through its very plainness, through the ordinary routine of a working ship recorded in careful handwriting until the moment when the handwriting simply stops. The logbook of the Mary Celeste is not a dramatic document. That is the first thing worth understanding about it. It is not a ship's journal in the literary sense, not a personal diary, not a record of thoughts and impressions and reflections on the sea. It is a working document, functional and precise, written in the language of navigation rather than the language of feeling. Positions, headings, wind direction, weather conditions, brief notes on sail changes and course corrections, the kind of record that a careful, experienced captain keeps because the sea requires precision, and precision requires writing things down. Benjamin Briggs was exactly that kind of captain, disciplined, methodical, deeply attentive to his responsibilities. The log he kept reflects those qualities. It is not the record of a man who was careless or casual about his duties. It is the record of a man who took his ship seriously and understood that a well-maintained log was part of what it meant to command a vessel properly. The Mary Celeste carried 2 forms of log record during her final voyage. The first was the official logbook, a bound volume in which the captain or first mate recorded formal entries. The second was the mate's slate log, sometimes called the deck log, which was a more informal running record kept on a slate board and updated more frequently, often multiple times a day. The slate log was the working document. The official log was the formal record. Together they were meant to give a complete picture of where the ship was and what conditions she was sailing through. When Oliver Deveau and his small boarding party came aboard the Mary Celeste on December 4th, 1872, they found both of these records. The official logbook was recovered intact. The slate log was also found, though it had not been transferred into the official log for several days, which was itself a small but interesting detail. It meant that the mate's slate entries from the final days of the voyage had not yet been transcribed, which suggests that the normal administrative routine of the ship had been interrupted at some point before the final departure. The last entry in the official log is dated November 24th, 1872. It records the ship's position as north of the Azores and notes the weather and heading in the standard abbreviated format that working logs use. There is nothing unusual about it. It reads exactly like every other entry that precedes it in the book. The handwriting is steady. The information is complete. There is no indication in that entry that anything was wrong or that anything unusual was expected. The last entry on the mate's slate is dated November 25th, 1872. It gives the ship's position as approximately 6 miles northwest of Santa Maria Island, the southernmost of the Azores. The time noted on the entry is around 8 o'clock in the morning. This entry is brief, as slate entries typically were, but it is legible and clear. It records the position, notes that the island was in sight, and contains no indication of distress, no mention of unusual weather, no reference to any problem with the ship or the cargo or the crew. After November 25th, there is nothing. The slate is blank. The official log has no further entries. Whatever happened to the 10 people aboard the Mary Celeste? It happened after 8 in the morning on the 25th of November, 1872, somewhere in the waters near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. This silence is the most important thing the log tells us. Not what it says, but where it stops saying anything. Because if there had been time, if the situation had developed slowly enough for anyone to reach for the log and write something down, they almost certainly would have. Briggs was not the kind of captain who would abandon his ship without making a record of why. He was the kind of captain who would write down what was happening, what he was doing, and why he was doing it. The fact that he did not write anything suggests that whatever happened, it happened quickly. Quickly enough that there was no time to reach for the logbook. Quickly enough that the only priority was getting off the ship. This is a small but significant piece of evidence, and it tends to support the theories that involve a sudden event rather than a slow deterioration. A slow leak, a growing structural problem, a creeping illness. Any of these would have given Briggs time to write. A sudden explosion, a violent shudder, a blast of vapour from the hold, a frightening and immediate shock of some kind. These would not. The blank pages after November 25th point towards something abrupt. There is another detail about the log worth examining carefully, and it is one that the fictional versions of the story consistently ignore. The log contains no mention of bad weather. In the days leading up to November 25th, the entries describe ordinary Atlantic sailing conditions, some rough weather in the early part of the voyage, but nothing catastrophic. This matters because one of the persistent popular theories about the Mary Celeste involves a sudden violent storm that frightened the crew into abandoning ship. The log does not support this. The weather described in the days before the final entry was not extreme. It was not calm either, because the North Atlantic in November is rarely calm, but it was within the range of conditions that an experienced crew on a well-found vessel would have managed without abandoning ship. Similarly, the log contains no mention of problems with the cargo, no notes about leaking barrels, no references to unusual smells in the hold, no indication that anyone had noticed anything wrong with the 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol sitting below decks. This absence does not disprove the alcohol vapour theory. It simply means that if the vapour was building up, no one had detected it yet, or no one had considered it serious enough to record. Alcohol vapour in a hold is not something that would necessarily be obvious until it reached a critical concentration, and by that point there might not have been time to write anything down. What the log also does not contain is any indication of conflict among the crew. No disciplinary entries, no notes about disputes, no references to illness or injury among the sailors. The crew appears in the log record as a functioning professional group doing their jobs on a straightforward Atlantic crossing. There is nothing in the written record to suggest that the people on that ship had any reason to harm each other or to flee from each other. The Gibraltar inquiry paid close attention to the log, as one would expect. Solly Flood, the Attorney General who led the investigation, and who was convinced from early on that something criminal had happened, examined the log entries carefully looking for signs of falsification or concealment. He found none. The log read as an authentic record of an ordinary voyage up to its abrupt stopping point. Even Flood, who was not inclined to give the evidence a charitable interpretation, could not find anything in the log itself to support his theory of foul play. The log was also examined for any indication that the final position entry on the slate had been altered or that the date had been changed. It had not. The November 25th entry appears to be exactly what it claims to be. The last routine position fix taken by the mate of the Mary Celeste at 8 o'clock in the morning, with Santa Maria Island visible on the horizon. This position is itself a useful piece of information. Santa Maria Island is the easternmost of the Azores, sitting at roughly 37 degrees north and 25 degrees west. The ship was 6 miles northwest of it when the last entry was made. When the Day Greater found the Mary Celeste 9 days later, she was approximately 400 miles to the east-northeast, in the waters between the Azores and the Portuguese coast. This means the ship had been drifting and sailing under partial canvas for 9 days, covering roughly 400 miles in a generally eastward direction, which is consistent with the prevailing winds and currents in that part of the Atlantic in late November. The drift path, when reconstructed using modern knowledge of Atlantic weather patterns and current dust, makes sense. The ship was not sailing in a straight line, but she was moving in a direction that the wind and current would naturally carry a vessel with partial sails set and no one at the helm. This reconstruction is one of the more useful contributions that modern research has made to the Mary Celeste story. It confirms that the timeline is coherent. The gap between the last log entry and the discovery is 9 days, and the distance the ship travelled in those 9 days is physically plausible given the conditions. There is no mysterious jump, no impossible gap, no evidence that the ship was somewhere it could not have been. The geography checks out. What the geography does not tell us is why the lifeboat left the ship near Santa Maria Island. The yawl was gone when Devoe boarded, and the trailing rope found hanging from the stern may have been the line used to tow the lifeboat before it parted or was cut. If the crew left the ship near Santa Maria, they were within sight of land. The island was visible according to the last log entry. If they left in the yawl and rowed or sailed toward Santa Maria, they might have expected to reach it. The island had a small population in 1872. It had a harbour. It was not an empty rock in the middle of the ocean. And yet no one from the Mary Celeste ever arrived at Santa Maria Island. No lifeboat was found, no bodies were recovered, no survivors appeared at any port. 10 people left the Mary Celeste somewhere near that island, and none of them were ever seen again. This is the part of the story where the log's silence becomes most painful. Because the log can tell us where they were on the morning of the 25th. It can tell us that they were near land, within sight of an island, on a ship that showed no signs of catastrophic damage. It can tell us that the weather had not been extreme. It can tell us that the crew had no recorded history of conflict or trouble, and then it stops. It gives us a location, and a date, and a time, and after that, nothing. The silence of the log is not mysterious in the supernatural sense. It is not eerie or inexplicable as a physical fact. Logs stop when the people writing them stop writing. What is genuinely difficult is reconciling what the log tells us. A ship in reasonable condition, near an island on a calm enough morning for a routine position fix with what happened next, which is that everyone on board disappeared and was never found. The log's final entry is dated November 25th, 1872, at approximately 8 in the morning, with Santa Maria Island in sight. That is the last known fact about the people who were aboard the Mary Celeste. Everything after that is inference theory and the long, patient silence of the Atlantic. There is something quietly significant about the ordinariness of that final entry. It is not a farewell. It is not a warning. It is not a record of fear or urgency or impending catastrophe. It is a position fix. It is the kind of entry that a first mate makes dozens of times on a voyage, a routine notation, a small act of professional diligence. The person who wrote it was doing their job. They were noting where the ship was, as they had been doing every day since leaving New York. They had no reason to think it would be the last entry they ever made. That ordinariness is, in its own quiet way, more affecting than any dramatic final log entry could be. A terrifying last message would fit the legend. A screamed warning or a desperate note would give the story a shape that satisfies the imagination. But a routine position fix written in the same steady hand as every other entry, followed by nothing, is something stranger and sadder than that. It is the record of a moment when everything was still normal, just before everything stopped being normal, and because no one survived to explain what happened between 8 o'clock on November the 25th and the moment when the lifeboat left the ship, that last ordinary entry sits at the edge of the unknown, pointing toward a gap that the log itself cannot fill. The ship, of course, went on without them. She sailed for 9 more days, partially rigged, unmanned, crossing roughly 400 miles of the Atlantic on wind and current alone, before the Day Greater spotted her behaving strangely on the afternoon of December 4th. During those 9 days, the log stayed exactly as it was. The final entry on the slate remained the final entry. The blank pages of the official log remained blank. The ship carried the record of her voyage eastward across the Atlantic, preserving the last known position of her crew in the careful handwriting of a first mate who had no idea he was writing the last thing that would ever be written about them. What the log cannot tell us is what came next. But the ship herself, her physical state when Devoe boarded her, the missing lifeboat, the trailing rope, the displaced compass, the sounding rod left on deck, the 9 empty barrels in the hold, all of these things have their own kind of testimony to offer. And when you put the log's evidence together with the physical evidence of the ship, a picture begins to form. It is incomplete. It has gaps that may never be filled. But it is a picture of something specific that happened on, or shortly after the morning of November 25th, 1872, near Santa Maria Island in the Azores. Something sudden, something frightening, something that caused 10 experienced people to leave a seaworthy vessel and row toward an island they could see on the horizon. Something that, whatever it was, they did not survive. The ship they left behind went on sailing without them, and eventually she carried the last record of their voyage into the hands of the men who found her. The log said nothing more. But the ship still had a story to tell. The Mary Celeste did not disappear with her crew. That is one of the stranger aspects of this whole story, and it is easy to overlook it in the shadow of the mystery itself. The people vanished. The ship did not. She went on sailing, and she went on living, in a manner of speaking, for another 13 years after the discovery. And the life she had after 1872 was not a peaceful one. After the Gibraltar inquiry concluded, the Mary Celeste was released back to her owners, the firm of James H. Winchester and his partners in New York. She'd been repaired and cleaned, her rigging put back in order, her hold emptied of the cargo that had finally reached Genoa on a different vessel. She was returned to service as a working merchant ship, which is what she had always been. The mystery that surrounded her name did not retire her. She was a vessel, and vessels were expensive, and so she went back to sea. But the years after 1872 were not kind to her. She changed hands repeatedly. Different captains, different routes, different cargoes. Some of the ownership changes were routine commercial transactions. Others reflected something harder to name, a reluctance on the part of experienced mariners to commit too deeply to a ship with that particular history. Whether or not sailors are superstitious by nature, they are practical, and a ship whose crew had vanished without explanation was not an asset that inspired confidence. The Mary Celeste's freight rates suffered. Her reputation preceded her in ports in a way that made business difficult. She accumulated a record of minor misfortunes over the following decade. Not catastrophes, nothing dramatic enough to make headlines the way the original mystery had, but a steady accumulation of the kinds of problems that made her expensive and unreliable. Groundings, cargo disputes, voyages that lost money, captains who took her on and then moved on. The ship passed through at least 17 different owners in the 13 years between the discovery and her end, which is a remarkable number even for a working brigantine of that era. Her final chapter came in January of 1885, and it was not a dignified one. By that point she'd come into the possession of a man named Captain Gilman C. Parker, who had purchased her along with a group of investors for what was, even at the time, considered a suspiciously low price. Parker loaded her with a cargo that was later found to be largely worthless, things like cat food, rubber boots, and cheap cutlery, items that had been fraudulently invoiced as far more valuable goods. He then sailed her toward the coast of Haiti, and on January 3rd, 1885, he deliberately ran her onto Rocheleau Reef, a reef near the Haitian coast that was well charted and easily avoidable by any competent navigator. The intention was to collect the insurance money on both the ship and the fraudulently valued cargo. It was a straightforward insurance fraud scheme, and Parker was not particularly subtle about it. The wreck was investigated, the fraud was discovered, and Parker and his associates were prosecuted in a federal court in Boston. The case was significant enough to attract considerable attention. Parker was convicted, but he died before he could be sentenced, which meant that the final owner of the Mary Celeste escaped the full legal consequences of what he had done to her. The wreck itself remained on Rocheleau Reef. Some efforts were made to salvage her in the weeks after the grounding, but the reef had done its work. She was too badly damaged to be worth saving. The ship that had sailed unmanned across 400 miles of the Atlantic, that had been found in good condition with her cargo intact and her captain's belongings still in his cabin, ended her life as a deliberate wreck on a Haitian reef, stripped of value by a man who had bought her for almost nothing and destroyed her for the insurance money. It is a bleak ending for a vessel that had already carried so much history. In 2001, a team led by the author and explorer Clive Cussler claimed to have located the wreck of the Mary Celeste on Rocheleau Reef using side scans, sonar and diving surveys. The announcement received a fair amount of attention. Cussler had a track record of locating historically significant wrecks, and the idea of physically finding the Mary Celeste, even in her final degraded state, was appealing to people who had followed the mystery. But the identification was subsequently disputed by other researchers and maritime historians, who pointed out that the wreck Cussler's team had found did not match the dimensions and construction details of the Mary Celeste closely enough to confirm the identification with confidence. The reef had other wrecks on it. The question of whether the remains Cussler found were actually the Mary Celeste was never definitively settled, which is, in a way, entirely consistent with everything else about this story. The families left behind by the disappearance lived with the uncertainty in ways that the historical record only partially captures. Benjamin Briggs's family, his mother, his brothers, his son Arthur, received no explanation, no bodies, no survivors, and no closure. His mother, Maria Briggs, who had received warm letters from her son before the voyage describing his hopes for the trip and his affection for his wife and daughter, spent the rest of her life without knowing what had happened to him. Arthur Briggs, the 7-year-old who had been left at home with his grandmother when the Mary Celeste departed New York, grew up as the son of a man who had simply ceased to exist somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. He lived until 1930, long enough to see the mystery become a global legend, long enough to read Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional version of events, long enough to watch the story of his father's disappearance become detached from any real connection to the people involved. The Briggs family, from what the historical record shows, never accepted any of the theories that circulated about what had happened. They rejected the suggestions of foul play. They rejected the idea that Benjamin Briggs had been involved in any fraud or conspiracy. They held to the belief that something had gone catastrophically wrong at sea, something natural and sudden, and that the people they had lost had died without fault of their own. Whether that belief was comforting or simply the only thing available to hold on to, it is difficult to say. Sarah Briggs's personal belongings, including letters she'd written and some of her sewing materials, were among the items recovered from the captain's cabin when the Dei Gratia crew boarded the ship. Some of these items eventually made their way back to her family. Her last letter home, written before the Mary Celeste left New York, described the voyage ahead with ordinary optimism. She mentioned the weather, the ship's condition, her daughter Sophia. She sounded like a woman who expected to arrive in Genoa, complete the business of the voyage, and return home. There is nothing in the letter that reads like a farewell, because it was not meant to be one. Oliver Deveau, the first mate of the Dei Gratia who had led the boarding party and spent days sailing the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar, almost single-handed with a small crew, gave the most detailed and consistent testimony of anyone connected to the case. His account of what he found on the ship remained largely stable across multiple interrogations by Solly Flood and the Gibraltar court, which was itself a point in his favour given how aggressively Flood had tried to find inconsistencies. Deveau described the ship calmly and precisely, the missing lifeboat, the state of the rigging, the personal belongings in the cabins, the food stores, the water in the hold. He did not embellish. He did not speculate dramatically. He said what he had seen. Deveau continued his maritime career after the Gibraltar proceedings concluded. He lived until 1912, which meant he was alive to see the mystery of the Mary Celeste become a permanent fixture of popular culture, to watch Doyle's fictional version spread around the world, to see the real facts of what he had found become buried under layers of invented detail. Whether he found any of this frustrating is not clearly documented. He gave interviews at various points in his later life and continued to describe what he had actually found, as opposed to what the legend claimed he had found. He seems to have been a straightforward man who had done an extraordinary piece of seamanship and received inadequate compensation for it. The salvage payment awarded to the Dei Gratia crew was, by most accounts, deeply unfair. The standard salvage award for bringing in a vessel in good condition was a substantial portion of the ship's value. The Mary Celeste and her cargo were worth a significant sum, but Solly Flood's persistent suspicion that the Dei Gratia crew had been involved in whatever happened to the Mary Celeste crew tainted the entire proceeding. The court awarded the Dei Gratia men approximately £1,700 against a potential claim that some estimates put at over £6,000. The men had risked their lives sailing an unfamiliar ship across the Atlantic in winter with a skeleton crew. They received a fraction of what they were owed. Flood himself never publicly acknowledged that his suspicions had been wrong. He had built a theory around the idea that the Dei Gratia crew, or possibly a conspiracy involving Captain Morehouse, had committed violence against the people aboard the Mary Celeste. He had the sword examined for blood. He had the deck stains analysed. He had the marks on the bow investigated as possible evidence of deliberate damage. None of it held up. The sword stains were not blood. The deck stains were not blood. The marks on the bow were consistent with normal wear and minor collision damage, but Flood was the kind of official who found it easier to maintain a position than to revise it, and so his suspicions remained on the record without ever being proven. What the aftermath of the case reveals, when you look at it carefully, is that the Mary Celeste mystery caused a certain amount of damage to almost everyone it touched. The Dei Gratia crew was underpaid and treated as suspects. The Briggs family received no answers. The ship herself was passed from owner to owner until someone finally destroyed her for profit. Even Solly Flood, who had conducted the investigation with such aggressive certainty, ended up with nothing to show for it but a theory that history largely dismissed. The mystery did not resolve itself into justice or clarity for anyone. It simply went on being a mystery, and the people connected to it were left to live alongside the unanswered questions. There is something worth pausing on here, which is the strangeness of the ship's continued existence after everything that had happened. The Mary Celeste had been found empty, had been the subject of a major international inquiry, had been the inspiration for one of the most famous fictional accounts of the 19th century, and had become the most talked about vessel in the maritime world. And then she just kept sailing. She loaded cargo and carried it across oceans. She was bought and sold. She sat in harbours waiting for the next voyage. The sailors who crewed her in those later years must have been aware of her history. It would have been impossible not to be. But ships need crews, and crews need wages, and so the Mary Celeste continued to work. The contrast between her fame and her continued ordinary existence is one of the quieter ironies of the whole story. She was the most famous ship in the world, and she spent the last 13 years of her life doing what she'd always done, carrying goods across water for whoever would pay to use her. Until the day her final owner decided she was worth more as a wreck than as a vessel, and took her out to a reef in Haiti and put an end to her there. The reef kept her, the ocean covered what was left, and the Mary Celeste, the actual physical ship, the 103-foot brigantine built in Nova Scotia in 1861, eventually became part of the seafloor near the Haitian coast, dissolving slowly into the reef that had broken her open. What remained was not the ship, but the story, and the story, as it turned out, was only getting started. Because while the ship was passing through her final years of troubled service, something else was happening in the wider world. The mystery was being picked up, reshaped, and handed to a public that was hungry for exactly this kind of story. The gap between what was known and what could be imagined was enormous, and that gap was about to be filled in ways that would change how the Mary Celeste was remembered forever. The real ship was ending. The legend was just beginning to find its shape. So that is where things stood for a long time. The mystery was old, the investigation was closed, the ship was gone, and the people who had actually been there were either dead or elderly. The story had passed out of the hands of witnesses and into the hands of historians, journalists, and eventually scientists. And what happened next, over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st, was a slow and sometimes contradictory process of people trying to apply modern tools to a very old question. The first thing worth understanding about modern investigations into the Mary Celeste is that they have not all been equal in rigour or honesty. Some have been careful and methodical. Others have been more interested in generating a compelling story than in getting the facts right. The mystery attracts both kinds of attention, and it is worth knowing the difference. One of the more dramatic claims came in 2001, when the author and adventurer Clive Cussler, who was known for funding real underwater search expeditions alongside his career writing adventure novels, announced that his team had located the wreck of the Mary Celeste off the coast of Haiti. Cussler had funded a genuine search operation, and the announcement attracted significant media coverage. The wreck was found near the area where the ship had been deliberately run aground in 1885, which was at least geographically plausible. But the identification was disputed fairly quickly by maritime historians and researchers who examined the evidence. The physical characteristics of the wreck did not match what was known about the Mary Celeste's construction and dimensions with sufficient precision, and the claim was eventually set aside by most serious researchers. It remains an interesting episode, not because it solved anything, but because it illustrated how powerfully the Mary Celeste draws people toward it. Even experienced, well-funded investigators found themselves pulled into the orbit of the mystery, and perhaps wanting a discovery more than the evidence quite supported. The more scientifically significant modern contribution came in 2006, and it did not involve diving equipment or underwater cameras. It happened in a chemistry laboratory at University College London. A chemist named Andrea Seller had been thinking about the alcohol vapour theory, the idea that fumes from the leaking barrels of industrial alcohol had built up in the ship's hold and then ignited in a sudden pressure explosion. The theory had been discussed before, but no one had actually tested it in any controlled way. Seller decided to build a physical model and see what would happen. The experiment was relatively simple in its design. Seller and his colleagues constructed a small-scale model of a ship's hold using wooden cubes to simulate the barrel storage. They introduced a mixture of alcohol vapour into the enclosed space and then ignited it. What they observed was striking. The vapour produced a powerful and visible flash, a sudden burst of combustion that was dramatic enough to be genuinely alarming if you were standing nearby. But here was the key finding. The flash left no burn marks on the wooden surfaces. The wood was unscorched. There was no fire damage, no charring, no evidence that anything had burned at all. The explosion was real, but it was clean. This mattered enormously in the context of the Mary Celeste, because one of the persistent objections to the alcohol vapor theory had always been the absence of fire damage on the ship. If there had been an explosion in the hold, why was there no evidence of burning? Sellers' experiment provided a direct answer. The kind of explosion that alcohol vapor produces in a confined space is not the kind that leaves burn marks. It is a pressure event, a sudden release of energy through combustion that flares and then vanishes before it has time to ignite the surrounding materials. It is terrifying to witness. It would feel, to anyone standing nearby, like the ship was about to explode catastrophically. But it would not necessarily set the ship on fire, and it would not leave the kind of physical evidence that investigators later looking for burn marks would expect to find. The 9 barrels that arrived empty in Genoa fit neatly into this picture. They were made of red oak rather than white oak, and red oak is significantly more porous. In the conditions of an Atlantic crossing, those barrels could reasonably have leaked enough vapour to create a dangerous concentration in the enclosed hold. A spark, or even the heat from a lantern, could have done the rest. Seller was careful in how he presented his findings. He did not claim to have solved the mystery. He said that the experiment demonstrated that the alcohol vapor explosion scenario was physically plausible and consistent with the known evidence, specifically the absence of fire damage. That is a meaningful distinction. Plausible and consistent is not the same as proven. There is still no direct evidence that an explosion actually occurred aboard the Mary Celeste. No witness described one. The log does not mention one. But the experiment removed what had been a significant objection to the theory, and it did so through actual science rather than speculation. Documentary investigations have returned to the Mary Celeste repeatedly over the decades, with Channel 4 in the United Kingdom and National Geographic both producing programs that examine the evidence at various points. These productions brought together maritime historians, forensic specialists and oceanographers, and their collective conclusions have generally pointed in the same direction as Sellers' work. The alcohol vapor theory remains the most coherent explanation, even if it cannot be definitively confirmed. Some of the forensic work done in connection with these investigations revisited the physical evidence that Solly Flood had collected back in 1872. The sword that Flood had believed showed traces of blood was examined again with modern techniques. The result was the same as the earlier analysis had suggested. The stains were not blood. They were consistent with rust and other oxidation products, which is exactly what you would expect to find on a blade that had been stored in a damp marine environment for any length of time. The reddish stains on the deck, which Flood had also pointed to as possible evidence of violence, similarly failed to produce any indication of blood under modern analysis. Flood's theory of foul play was not just unsupported by the evidence available in 1872, it continued to be unsupported by every subsequent examination of that same evidence. Archival research has also contributed to a clearer picture of the ship's history and construction. Dendrochronology, the science of dating wood by analysing its growth rings, has been applied to documentary evidence about the ship's building materials, helping researchers understand the timeline of her construction at Spencer's Island more precisely. This kind of work does not generate dramatic headlines, but it matters because it grounds the story in verifiable physical reality rather than legend. It helps distinguish what is actually known about the Mary Celeste from what has been assumed or invented. One of the more interesting applications of modern technology to the mystery has been the reconstruction of the ship's probable drift path between November 25th, when the last log entry was made, and December 4th, when the Dei Gratia found her. The position recorded in the mate's slate log on November 25th placed the Mary Celeste approximately 6 miles northwest of Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The Dei Gratia found her roughly 400 miles to the east of the Azores 9 days later. Using modern understanding of Atlantic currents, prevailing winds in that region during late November and early December, and the known sail configuration of the ship at the time of discovery, researchers have been able to model how an unmanned vessel in that position and condition would have moved over those 9 days. The results of this reconstruction are consistent with the physical evidence. A ship with partial sails set, drifting under the influence of Atlantic currents and wind, could plausibly have covered that distance in that time. The drift path does not require any unusual assumptions. It fits what is known about the oceanography of the region. This matters because it closes off one avenue of speculation that had occasionally appeared in discussions of the mystery. The idea that the timeline did not make physical sense, that the ship could not have drifted that far in 9 days without some additional explanation. The modern reconstruction suggests that it could, and that the gap between the last log entry and the discovery is entirely consistent with normal Atlantic conditions. What all of this modern work adds up to is something more modest than a solution, but more substantial than nothing. It is a process of elimination and clarification. The forensic work rules out foul play with increasing confidence. The oceanographic reconstruction confirms the physical plausibility of the timeline. Seller's experiment demonstrates that the most widely accepted natural explanation is scientifically coherent. The archival research removes mythological accretions and leaves a cleaner factual record. What it does not do is provide a moment of certainty. There is no document, no recovered artifact, no physical trace that says definitively, this is what happened on the morning of November the 25th, or the 26th, or whenever it was that the crew of the Mary Celeste stepped into their yawl and left the ship behind. That moment remains unwitnessed and unrecorded. Whatever the crew experienced, whatever they saw or heard or felt that convinced them to abandon a seaworthy vessel in the middle of the Atlantic, it left no direct evidence. Only the empty ship, the missing people, and the trailing rope at the stern. There is one detail that modern researchers have paid particular attention to, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment. The rope. A long line was found hanging from the stern of the Mary Celeste, trailing in the water behind the ship. It was frayed at the end, suggesting it had been cut or had parted under tension. The most natural explanation is that this rope was used as a tether for the yawl. If the crew launched the small boat and tied it to the ship with a line, they could have maintained a connection to the Mary Celeste while they waited to see whether whatever had frightened them was going to destroy the ship. If there had been an explosion in the hold, or a sudden violent shuddering from a seaquake, the instinct might have been to get clear of the vessel, but stay close enough to return if it proved safe. The frayed end of the rope suggests that the connection eventually broke. Whether it was cut deliberately, parted under the strain of the sea, or was severed by some other means is not known. But if the yawl had been tethered to the ship and the line broke, the crew would have found themselves adrift in the open Atlantic, separated from the Mary Celeste, with no means of getting back to her. In those conditions, in November, in the North Atlantic, the outcome would not have been difficult to predict. The yawl was a small boat. The ocean was large and cold. No trace of the crew was ever found. This scenario, a panicked but organised departure, a tethered yawl, a broken line, a crew left adrift, fits the physical evidence as well as anything else that has been proposed. It is not proven. It cannot be proven, but it is coherent and it is human. It describes people making a reasonable decision under extreme fear and then being killed not by violence or malice, but by the simple, indifferent mechanics of a rope under tension in a rough sea. Modern science has brought the Mary Celeste mystery closer to a probable explanation than it has ever been. The case for an alcohol vapour event followed by a panicked abandonment and a broken tether line is, at this point, the most evidence-consistent account available. Researchers who have examined the question carefully, without an agenda, tend to arrive at some version of this conclusion. The mystery is not as deep as the legend suggests. It may have a perfectly ordinary if tragic answer, but ordinary answers have a way of feeling insufficient when the question has been asked for 150 years. And that, in a quiet way, is part of what makes the modern investigation of the Mary Celeste so interesting. Science can narrow the possibilities. It can remove the implausible and support the plausible. What it cannot do is satisfy the part of us that feels the story deserves something more than a leaking barrel and a frayed rope. That tension between the likely explanation and the one we feel the story requires is something worth thinking about. Because it tells us something not just about the Mary Celeste, but about why certain mysteries hold us the way they do, and what it means when a story becomes larger than its own facts, which is exactly where the next part of this story takes us. There is something worth pausing on here, something that goes beyond the physical evidence and the scientific experiments and the archival corrections. The Mary Celeste is not the only ship that has ever been found abandoned. It is not even the only ghost ship with a mysterious history. There have been others, some of them stranger in certain respects, some of them with circumstances that were, if anything, harder to explain, and yet none of them have lasted in the imagination the way this one has. None of them have accumulated 150 years of books, documentaries, theories, arguments, and quiet fascination. So the question worth asking is not just what happened to the crew, but why this particular disappearance has refused to let go of us. Why the Mary Celeste, of all the ships that have ever sailed and all the tragedies that have ever happened at sea, became the one that people still talk about tonight. Take the Carol A. Deering, for instance. She was an American 5-masted commercial schooner found run aground on Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, in January 1921. Her crew of 11 was gone. The lifeboats were missing. Food was reportedly being prepared in the galley. The anchors had been dropped in an unusual way, suggesting the crew may have been trying to stop the ship. The steering mechanism was damaged. Red lights had been seen from shore. The investigation involved the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the Justice Department. It went nowhere. The crew was never found. The Carol A. Deering, by any reasonable measure, is at least as mysterious as the Mary Celeste, and most people have never heard of her, or consider the Joyita, a 69-foot vessel found adrift in the South Pacific in October 1955, about 600 miles off course from her planned route between Samoa and the Tokelau Islands. 25 people had been on board. All of them were gone. The ship was heavily listing, partly flooded but still afloat. The radio had been set to a distress frequency but was faulty and had a very short range. The clocks had stopped. Some cargo was missing. Blood-stained bandages were found on deck. A doctor's bag was found open. The case was investigated and theorised about extensively at the time, and several explanations have been proposed over the years, including piracy, though none has been conclusively proven. And again, most people outside maritime history circles have never heard of the Joyita. There was also the Kaz II, a 10-metre catamaran found sailing off the coast of Queensland, Australia, in April 2007. 3 men had set out on her. She was found with the engine running, sails set, a table laid with food and no one on board. The investigation eventually concluded that one man had probably fallen overboard, and the other 2 had gone in after him and drowned, or been unable to reboard the vessel. A sad accident, essentially, solved within a reasonable time frame, not a mystery that has endured. So what is it about the Mary Celeste that the others do not have? Part of the answer is timing. The Mary Celeste disappeared in 1872, at a moment when the reading public of the English-speaking world was hungry for exactly this kind of story. The late 19th century was a period of enormous appetite for adventure, exploration, and the mysterious. Newspapers were reaching wider audiences than ever before. Serialized fiction was enormously popular. The ocean was a place of both commerce and romance in the public imagination. A ship found sailing empty in the Atlantic, with no explanation and no survivors, landed in this cultural moment with perfect timing. It became a story almost immediately, not just a news item, but a narrative, something people wanted to discuss and imagine and argue about. And then Arthur Conan Doyle made it permanent. When his story appeared in 1884, it did something that factual reporting could not quite do on its own. It gave the Mary Celeste a shape. It gave it atmosphere. It gave it the half-eaten breakfast, the sleeping cat, the terrifying final log entry. None of those details were real, but they were vivid, and vividness is what makes stories stick. Once those images were in circulation, they became almost impossible to dislodge. People who encountered the real facts found them slightly disappointing by comparison. The real story had a missing lifeboat and a frayed rope and 9 leaking barrels of industrial alcohol. The fictional version had something that felt more like a riddle, a locked room with the door still open, and people prefer riddles. But there is something deeper than timing and fiction at work here. Something that has to do with the specific nature of what was found. The Mary Celeste was not wrecked. She was not burned. She was not sinking. She was sailing. She was moving through the water under partial sail, making progress, holding her course roughly in the direction of the Strait of Gibraltar, as if she simply did not need her crew anymore. That detail, the ship continuing on without the people who were supposed to be guiding her, is the thing that catches in the imagination and does not let go. It feels like a statement, though of course it is not one. A ship does not make statements. It drifts according to wind and current. But the image of the Mary Celeste moving through the grey Atlantic, empty and purposeful looking, touches something that is hard to name precisely. There is a particular kind of discomfort that humans feel when they encounter a space that should be occupied but is not. An empty chair at a table, a lit window in a house where no one is home, a phone ringing in a room where the person who owned it will never answer it again. These things unsettle us in a way that a straightforward disaster does not. A wreck is a tragedy. An absence is something else. It is open-ended. It does not resolve. The Mary Celeste is, in a sense, the largest possible version of that feeling. An entire ship, an entire life at sea, an entire small community of people, simply not there, and the ship still moving. Psychologists who study what is sometimes called the Zeigarnik effect, named after the Russian psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who observed in the 1920s that people remember uncompleted tasks better than completed ones, would probably find the Mary Celeste a useful case study. The human mind is built to seek closure. When a story ends cleanly, the brain files it away and moves on. When a story does not end, when it stops mid-sentence, the mind keeps returning to it. The Mary Celeste stopped mid-sentence on November 25th, 1872, and has never finished. Every theory that has been proposed is, in a way, an attempt to write the rest of that sentence. And because none of them can be proven, the sentence remains open, and the mind keeps coming back. This is not a weakness or an irrationality. It is simply how human cognition works when faced with incomplete information. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We are story-completing creatures. And the Mary Celeste offers a pattern with a missing piece that cannot be recovered. The piece is at the bottom of the Atlantic, or dissolved into the cold water of 1872, or simply gone in the way that most moments are gone once no one is left to remember them. The incompleteness is not a feature of the mystery, it is the mystery. There is also something worth saying about the sea itself and what it represents in the human imagination. The ocean has always been the place where the known world ends. For most of human history, it was the boundary of the map, the edge beyond which the cartographers wrote their warnings or left the space blank. Even now, when we have satellite imagery of every square metre of the ocean's surface and bathymetric charts of most of the seafloor, the ocean retains something of that quality. It is large in a way that is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. It is deep in a way that is genuinely difficult to imagine. And it does not give things back. Whatever the ocean takes, it keeps. The crew of the Mary Celeste, wherever they ended up, were taken by the Atlantic and kept. There is no grave, no marker, no place to go and stand and feel that something has been honoured. They are simply gone, in the way that the sea makes people gone, completely and without ceremony. This is part of why the story carries weight that a land-based disappearance might not. When people vanish on land, there is usually eventually some trace, a body, an object, a fragment of something that can be found and identified and given back to the people who are waiting. The sea does not work that way. The sea is the original unsolved case, the one where the evidence is always underwater and the witnesses are always the waves. And then there is the specific cast of characters, which matters more than it might seem at first. Benjamin Briggs was not a reckless adventurer or a desperate man taking risks for money. He was a careful, religious, experienced captain who had invested his own savings in the ship. Sarah Briggs was a young mother who brought her 2-year-old daughter on the voyage because she wanted to be with her husband. These were not people who made careless decisions. These were not people who were likely to panic without reason. When careful, experienced people do something that looks like panic, it suggests that whatever they encountered was genuinely frightening. And the fact that we cannot know what that thing was makes their decision to leave the ship feel both more understandable and more haunting. The 2-year-old girl, Sophia Matilda, is perhaps the detail that settles most heavily. She had no choice about being on that ship. She was there because her parents brought her, and they brought her because they loved her and wanted to keep the family together. Whatever happened on the morning the crew left, she was part of it. She was 2 years old, and she was on a small boat in the North Atlantic in late November, and she was never seen again. That fact does not require elaboration. It simply sits there, at the centre of the story, and it is the reason that the mystery of the Mary Celeste is not just an interesting puzzle, but a genuine tragedy. The most plausible explanation, the alcohol vapour event, the panicked departure, the tethered yawl, the broken rope, is in some ways the saddest possible answer. It means the crew of the Mary Celeste may have died not because of violence or malice, or even a catastrophic natural event, but because of a series of reasonable decisions made under extreme fear that happened to go wrong in sequence. They heard or felt something that terrified them. They made the sensible choice to get clear of the ship. They stayed close enough to return if it was safe, and then the rope broke, and the sea did the rest. There was no monster, no villain, no grand cosmic event, just industrial alcohol, porous wood, a cold November sea, and a rope that could not hold. That is, in a quiet way, more disturbing than any of the dramatic alternatives, because it means the outcome was not inevitable. It means that if the rope had held for another hour, or if the vapour had not built up quite so fast, or if the yawl had been tied with a slightly stronger line, 10 people might have returned to that ship and sailed on to Genoa, and gone home to their families and been forgotten by history in the way that most voyages are forgotten. The whole thing could have been nothing. A scare, a story to tell at dinner, a footnote. Instead, it became the most famous maritime mystery in the world, because a rope broke in the North Atlantic in 1872, and no one was there to see it. It is also worth noting that the endurance of the mystery has not been entirely without cost. The real story of the Mary Celeste has been buried under so many layers of fiction, speculation and embellishment that extracting the actual facts requires real effort. Researchers who have devoted serious time to the case have sometimes expressed frustration at how thoroughly the Doyle version colonised the public understanding. The half-eaten breakfast that was never there, the cat that was never mentioned in any testimony, the log entries that were never written. These inventions are so deeply embedded in the popular version of the story that they still appear in articles and books and online discussions, repeated confidently by people who have no idea they are describing a short story from 1884 rather than a historical record. The fictional Mary Celeste and the real one have been sailing alongside each other for so long that most people cannot tell them apart, and the fictional one has always been more compelling. In a strange way, this is its own kind of mystery. Not what happened to the crew, but what happens to a true story when it becomes famous. The Mary Celeste case suggests that fame does not preserve the truth of a story, it transforms it. It adds the details the story seems to need, removes the ones that feel too ordinary, and gradually replaces the complicated human reality with something cleaner and more satisfying to the imagination. The real Mary Celeste was a working merchant vessel, carrying industrial alcohol. crewed by careful professionals, commanded by a man who wrote ordinary letters to his mother. The famous Mary Celeste is a ghost ship drifting through fog with a breakfast still warm on the table and a mystery that can never be solved. Both versions have been sailing for 150 years, and the famous one has always travelled faster. What this means for how we think about the case today is something worth carrying forward, because it shapes not just how we understand the Mary Celeste, but how we understand the stories we tell about things we cannot fully explain. The gap between what is known and what is felt to be true is where legends live. And the Mary Celeste has lived in that gap for longer than almost any other story of its kind. Which brings us finally to the question of what the story ultimately leaves us with, and what it means to sit with a mystery that is probably solvable in broad outline but will never be resolved with certainty, and to ask whether that is something we can accept, or whether the need for a final answer is itself part of what the story is really about. And so we return, as all good stories eventually do, to the water. The North Atlantic in December 1872 was cold and grey and indifferent, as it always is, as it always will be. It did not know it was carrying a mystery. It did not know that the small brigantine moving slowly eastward through its swells would one day be the subject of books and documentaries and late-night conversations between people who would never come close to its waters. The ocean simply moved as it does, and the ship moved with it, sails partially set, deck empty, heading more or less toward the Strait of Gibraltar, as if someone had pointed it in the right direction and walked away. That image, the ship sailing on without anyone aboard, has never quite lost its power. There is something in it that resists easy explanation, not because the facts are so complicated, but because the feeling it produces is so specific. A ship is a human thing. It is built by hands, named by people, crewed by lives. To find one sailing alone is to encounter a kind of absence that has a shape. The absence is not just of people, but of the ordinary noise and movement and intention that makes a vessel feel inhabited. The Mary Celeste, when the De Grutier crew boarded her on that December afternoon, was not wrecked. She was not sinking. She was simply empty in a way that felt wrong, and that wrongness has echoed forward through 150 years without ever quite fading. The 10 people who were on that ship deserve to be named one more time, not as clues or variables in a puzzle, but as people. Benjamin Briggs, 37 years old, a careful and experienced captain who wrote warm letters to his mother and ran a dry ship because he believed in discipline and responsibility. Sarah Briggs, 30 years old, who brought her sewing machine on the voyage and played the melodeon in the evenings and chose to sail with her husband because the alternative was months of separation. Sophia Matilda Briggs, 2 years old, who had no opinion on the matter and whose toys were found exactly where she had left them. Albert Richardson, the first mate. Edward Head, the cook. Volkert Lorenzen, Bos Lorenzen, Adrian Lorenzen, Arian Martins, Gottlieb Gonderschalk. 5 sailors whose lives extended in all directions beyond this single voyage, who had families and histories and reasons for being at sea that had nothing to do with becoming famous for disappearing. None of them were ever found. Not a body, not a piece of clothing washed ashore, not a single trace that could be definitively tied to the people who left that ship. The North Atlantic is large and cold, and it keeps what it takes, and in this case it kept everything. The alcohol vapour theory remains the most supported explanation. It fits the physical evidence better than any other. The 9 empty barrels of red oak, more porous than they should have been. The sounding rod left on deck, the binnacle displaced, the navigational instruments taken suggesting a planned departure rather than a sudden one, the rope trailing from the stern frayed at the end, the ship in otherwise good condition, cargo intact, no fire damage, no structural failure. All of it points toward a crew that left deliberately, in a hurry, for a reason that felt urgent and temporary, a crew that expected to return. The 2006 experiment by Andrea Sella at University College London gave that theory its most compelling support. Alcohol vapor in a confined space, ignited, can produce a sudden and dramatic pressure event, a flash of force and light without leaving burn marks or structural damage. It would explain why the crew was frightened enough to leave and why, when they looked back at the ship from the yawl, it appeared undamaged and intact. It would explain why they stayed close, tethered by a rope, waiting to see if it was safe to go back. It would explain almost everything except the rope. The rope is the part that stays with you. A long line trailing from the stern, frayed at the end where it had broken. If the yawl was attached to the ship by that rope, and the rope broke, then the crew of the Mary Celeste did not choose to drift away. They were separated from the ship by a failure of equipment in conditions that would have made returning nearly impossible. The North Atlantic in late November does not offer second chances. A small open boat, 10 people including a 2-year-old child, no shelter, cold water, open sea. The outcome of that situation is not difficult to imagine, and it is not a gentle one. But it is worth saying clearly, and without overstating it, that this is still a theory. A well-supported theory, a plausible one, the kind of theory that satisfies most of the available evidence. But the Mary Celeste case was never formally resolved, and no new evidence has emerged in the century and a half since the ship was found to confirm what actually happened in the hours after November 25th, 1872. The log goes silent, the ship sails on, and the gap between the last entry and the moment of discovery remains exactly what it has always been. A silence of 9 days in which anything is possible and nothing is proven. There is a certain kind of person who finds that unsatisfying, who feels that a mystery without a solution is somehow incomplete, that the story owes us a resolution. And there is something understandable in that feeling. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We tell stories with beginnings and middles and ends, and a story that stops in the middle feels like a sentence left unfinished. The Mary Celeste has been generating proposed endings for 150 years, precisely because the real ending was lost at sea, and the human mind does not rest easily with that kind of open space. But perhaps the more honest response is to accept that some questions belong to the past in a way that cannot be undone. The ocean does not preserve evidence the way a locked room does. The witnesses are gone. The ship herself is gone, deliberately wrecked on a Haitian reef in 1885 by a man trying to commit insurance fraud, which is perhaps the most undignified ending a famous vessel could have. The documents that survive are partial. The testimony that exists was given under legal pressure in a proceeding shaped by a suspicious investigator who had already decided what he thought had happened. The conditions for a clean answer were never really there, and they are certainly not there now. What remains is the shape of the story, and the shape of the story is, when you look at it honestly, a human one. A family that wanted to stay together chose to sail across the Atlantic together. A ship with a troubled history carried industrial cargo across a cold sea. Something happened that frightened experienced people badly enough to make them leave. A rope broke. The sea did what the sea does. And the ship sailed on without them, indifferent and intact, until another crew found her and brought her into port and started asking questions that could not be answered. That is the Mary Celeste. Not a supernatural event, not a conspiracy, not a visitation from something beyond explanation. Just a series of ordinary and terrible things that happened in sequence to ordinary and real people, in a place where no one could help them and no one could see. The mystery is not that something impossible occurred. The mystery is that something very possible occurred and left no survivors to explain it. The fictional version of this story, the one Arthur Conan Doyle gave us in 1884, with its warm breakfast and its sleeping cat and its terrifying log entries, was always more satisfying than the real one. Fiction can afford to be satisfying. It can shape events toward meaning, toward revelation, toward the kind of ending that makes a reader feel that the story was worth following. The real Mary Celeste offers none of that. It offers a ship, a silence, and a rope with a frayed end. It offers the names of 10 people who went to sea and did not come back. It offers a mystery that is probably, in broad terms, solvable, but that will never be confirmed because the people who knew the answer took it with them into the North Atlantic in late November 1872, and the North Atlantic did not give it back. If you have a theory about what happened, the comments are a good place to share it. Whether you find the alcohol vapour explanation convincing, or whether something else in the evidence has always struck you as more significant, it is the kind of question that tends to stay with people, and it is worth thinking through carefully. The Mary Celeste case rewards careful thinking. It punishes certainty. For now, though, let the ship sail. Let it move eastward through the grey December water, sails catching the wind, hull steady, deck empty. Let it find its way toward the Strait of Gibraltar, as if it knows the route, as if the knowledge of the passage is held somewhere in the wood and rope and canvas of the vessel itself, independent of the people who are no longer there to guide it. There is something almost peaceful about that image if you let it be. The ship sailing on, the sea around it enormous and quiet, the winter light low on the horizon. Somewhere behind it, in the direction it came from, 10 people are gone, and the ship does not know that. The ship just sails. Thank you for spending this time here tonight. Wherever you were listening from, whatever the hour was, whatever the weather outside your window, I hope this story was worth the company. If it was, a like or a subscription to Life Beyond Seen means a great deal, and it helps this quiet space reach other people who might be glad to find it. Until next time, take care of yourselves and sleep well.